Beneath the layers of ice that haven't moved for thousands of years, something has been quietly waiting. Not discovered all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, as the surface begins to shift. Tonight on Made for Sleep, we'll drift through the idea of an unexplained civilization found beneath the ice, following the fragments, the interpretations, and the quiet space between what's known and what's still unfolding. This episode is thoughtfully researched and gently curated by our team, shaped into a slower story you can simply listen to and rest with. Let the rain fall softly around you, and if you're still awake, feel free to share how you're doing and what time of night it is where you are. The glaciers of Northern Europe and North America have been retreating for decades, exposing landscapes that haven't seen daylight in millennia. With each passing season, more ground emerges from beneath the ice, and with it, traces of human presence that challenge our understanding of how and where people lived in the past. This is a story about what happens when frozen time begins to thaw. You're walking across a snowfield in southern Norway, following a researcher who knows this landscape the way some people know the rooms of their childhood home. The year is recent, close enough to now that the equipment you're carrying is recognisable, the methods familiar. But the discoveries being made here belong to a different time entirely, to periods when the climate was different, when these mountains were passable in summer, when people moved through valleys that would later be sealed under ice for centuries. The researcher stops and crouches down near a patch of exposed ground where the snow has melted away. She's looking at something dark against the pale rock and dirt. At first, you can't tell what it is. Just a shape, organic and irregular, half embedded in the soil. She doesn't touch it. That's the first rule of glacial archaeology, the discipline that's emerged over the past few decades, as the ice has retreated and revealed what it's been hiding. Look, observe, photograph, document position. Don't disturb anything until you understand what you're seeing and what it might mean. You move closer, carefully, trying not to step on anything that might be significant. The object resolves itself as you approach. It's fabric, or what used to be fabric. Dark, waterlogged, partially decomposed but still recognisably textile. Woven material, the individual thread still visible despite centuries of exposure to moisture and cold. The researcher takes out her camera and begins photographing from multiple angles. She's documenting the find in situ, recording its exact position, its orientation, its relationship to the surrounding terrain. Later, these photographs will be part of the official record, evidence that will be studied by other researchers, referenced in papers, used to build understanding of what this place was and who used it. This happens more often than you might think. Since the late 1990s, when warming temperatures began accelerating the retreat of alpine glaciers and ice patches, archaeologists in Norway, Switzerland, Austria, Canada and Alaska have been finding artifacts emerging from the ice, not occasionally, regularly. Sometimes dozens of objects in a single season, spanning thousands of years of human activity. The finds range from the mundane to the extraordinary. Shoes, thousands of years old, still recognisable as shoes. Arrows with intact shafts and fletching, so well preserved that you can see the binding patterns, the workmanship, the individual choices made by whoever crafted them. Textiles, tools, even organic remains like horse dung and reindeer antlers, all emerging from the ice in conditions that allow for detailed analysis. What makes these discoveries significant isn't just their age or their preservation, it's what they reveal about human movement and adaptation. These artifacts are being found at high elevations, in mountain passes and on ice patches that are frozen for most of the year even now. The presence of human artifacts in these locations means people were travelling through high mountain terrain, probably seasonally, using routes that would later become impassable as the climate cooled and the ice expanded. The researcher carefully measures the distance from the textile fragment to several fixed reference points. Large boulders, distinctive rock formations, anything that will allow the exact location to be reconstructed later. She's using a handheld GPS unit to record coordinates, accurate to within a few metres. The measurements go into a field notebook, written clearly in waterproof ink. You ask her how old she thinks the textile might be. She doesn't answer immediately. That's not evasiveness, just caution. Dating requires laboratory analysis, usually radiocarbon dating of organic material, and even then the results come with margins of error. But based on the style of weaving visible in the fragment, based on similar finds from this region, she estimates it could be anywhere from 800 to 2,000 years old. Think about that range, 800 to 2000 years. That's the span from the Viking Age to the Late Bronze Age, from a period of written records and established kingdoms to a time when writing was rare in this part of the world, and history was preserved through oral tradition. And somewhere in that span, someone walked through this mountain pass wearing or carrying this textile. Maybe it was part of their clothing. Maybe it was a bag or a bundle wrapping. Maybe it was dropped accidentally, or discarded because it was damaged, or left behind when someone died in the mountains and their companions could only carry so much back down. Whatever the circumstances, the textile ended up here, on this patch of ground, where it was gradually covered by snow that compressed into ice. And there it stayed, frozen and protected, while centuries passed, while the climate shifted, while the ice expanded and contracted in response to changes in temperature and precipitation that operated on timescales much longer than human lifespans. The researcher finishes her documentation and carefully collects the textile fragment, placing it in a sterile bag labelled with the location, date, and a unique identification number. The bag goes into a cooler, where it will stay cold until it can be transported to a laboratory for analysis. Temperature control is critical. These artifacts have been frozen for centuries. Allowing them to warm up and dry out too quickly can cause damage, can destroy the very features that make them valuable for research. You continue walking, scanning the ground as you go. The researcher explains that this is how most glacial archaeology happens, not through systematic excavation, but through reconnaissance, through regular monitoring of areas where the ice is retreating, looking for artifacts that are being exposed naturally as the snow melts. It's a race against time. Once an artifact emerges from the ice, it begins to deteriorate. Exposure to sunlight, to oxygen, to fluctuating temperatures, all of these accelerate decay. Organic materials like wood, leather, and textile can survive for thousands of years frozen in ice. But once they thaw, they can decompose in a matter of seasons. Some artifacts that emerge one summer are nothing but fragments by the next. This has created new urgency in archaeology. Glacial archaeologists now spend their summers monitoring ice patches and glacier edges, returning to the same locations year after year, checking for new finds. It's physically demanding work. The sites are at high elevations, often requiring hours of hiking to reach. The weather is unpredictable. The working season is short, limited to the brief window when the snow has melted enough to expose artifacts, but hasn't yet refrozen for winter. But the results have been remarkable. In Norway alone, the Glacier Archaeology program has recovered thousands of artifacts from melting ice, including some that have fundamentally changed understanding of how people used mountain landscapes in the past. You reach another area of exposed ground, this one larger, maybe 20 meters across. The snow has retreated from a slight depression in the terrain, creating a bowl-shaped area where meltwater has collected and then drained away, leaving behind a surface of gravel and mud. The researcher slows down, moving more carefully now. This kind of terrain, a natural trap where snow accumulates and melts repeatedly, is exactly where artifacts tend to appear. Objects that were lost or discarded on the ice would have been covered by subsequent snowfalls, but as the ice melts, they become concentrated in low spots like this one. She spots something almost immediately, a piece of wood, about as long as your forearm, partially embedded in the gravel. You can see even from a distance that it's been worked, that it's not just a natural stick. One end is carved to a point. The other end shows tool marks where it was shaped and smoothed. The researcher crouches beside it, begins her documentation process again. Photographs from multiple angles, GPS coordinates, measurements, notes about the exact position and condition. All of this before anyone touches the object. While she works, she explains that this is probably part of an arrow. Based on the size and shape, based on comparison with other finds from Norwegian ice patches, it's likely a main shaft section. The central part of an arrow that would have had a separate foreshaft at the tip where the arrowhead was attached, and fletching at the back for stability in flight. This kind of composite arrow construction was common across northern Europe and parts of North America for thousands of years. Different woods were selected for different parts of the arrow based on their properties. The main shaft might be pine or birch, relatively straight-grained and easy to work. The foreshaft, which had to withstand the impact of hitting the target, might be made from denser wood like dogwood or viburnum. The components were fitted together with bindings made from sinew or plant fibre, creating an arrow that was both effective and repairable. What's remarkable is that examples of these composite arrows, complete with their bindings intact, have been recovered from Norwegian ice. Not reconstructions or guesses based on archaeological evidence, but actual arrows, thousands of years old, that show exactly how they were made, what materials were used, how the components were fitted together. The researcher carefully extracts the shaft section from the gravel. It's surprisingly solid despite its age, the wood still firm, the tool mark still sharp and clear. She places it in a padded container, labels it, adds it to the growing collection of finds from this season. You ask her why people were up here in the first place. Why travel through high mountain passes when lower routes would have been easier, safer, more predictable? The answer is complex, she says, and still being researched. But the evidence suggests several possibilities. Hunting was certainly one reason. Reindeer and other game animals use ice patches in summer to escape heat and insects. Hunters following these animals would have travelled to high elevations, would have lost or discarded equipment in the snow. Many of the artefacts found in Norwegian ice are hunting related. Arrows, spears, walking sticks, remains of wooden structures that might have been hunting blinds. But there's also evidence of travel, of people crossing mountain passes to move between valleys. Some of the finds include items that wouldn't be necessary for hunting. Textiles, tools for domestic tasks, objects that suggest people were travelling for trade or seasonal migration rather than just pursuing game. The distribution of artefacts supports this interpretation. They're not randomly scattered but concentrated along specific routes. Routes that follow natural corridors through the mountains. Routes that would make sense for someone trying to get from one valley to another with minimum elevation gain and maximum efficiency. These weren't modern hiking trails with markers and maintained paths. They were routes learned through experience, passed down through generations, known to people who travelled them regularly and understood the terrain, the weather patterns, the seasonal windows when passage was possible. And then the climate changed. Not suddenly. Climate never changes suddenly on human timescales. But gradually, over decades and centuries, the temperatures dropped, the snow accumulated, the ice patches expanded. Routes that had been passable in summer became increasingly difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. The high mountain passes closed, sealed under permanent snow and ice. The people who had used these routes adapted. They found other paths, lower elevations, longer routes that avoided the mountains. The high passes were abandoned, not all at once, but gradually, as each generation found them a little more difficult, a little less reliable, until eventually they stopped being used at all. And the artefacts that had been left behind, the lost arrows, the discarded tools, the occasional unfortunate traveller who died in the mountains, were covered by snow, preserved in ice, removed from the flow of time, until now. Until the climate shifted again, temperatures rose, and the ice began its retreat. Now those artefacts are emerging, appearing on the surface after centuries of frozen darkness, still recognisable, still interpretable, still able to tell their stories if someone knows how to read them. You continue across the exposed ground, moving slowly, scanning constantly. The researcher explains that many finds are discovered entirely by chance. Someone hiking across a snowfield spots something dark against the white, investigates, realises it's not a rock or piece of vegetation but an artefact. But there's also systematic monitoring now. Researchers return to known sites year after year, documenting how the ice edge is changing, where new ground is being exposed, what artefacts are appearing. Some programs use remote sensing, satellite imagery, aerial photography to identify areas where rapid melting is occurring, areas that should be prioritised for ground surveys. It's a global phenomenon. While Norway has been particularly successful with its glacier archaeology program, similar work is happening wherever glaciers and ice patches are retreating. In the Yukon, researchers have found entire hunting camps emerging from ice patches, complete with tools, weapons, and the remains of animals that were hunted and butchered on site. In the Alps, hikers regularly discover artefacts from everything from Neolithic travellers to Roman-era soldiers to medieval traders. Each find adds to the picture, fills in gaps in understanding about how people lived, moved, and adapted to changing conditions. But each find is also a reminder of what's being lost. For every artefact that's discovered and documented, there are probably dozens that emerge, decompose, and disappear before anyone sees them. The ice is revealing its secrets faster than archaeologists can document them. The researcher checks her watch. It's getting late. the sun starting its long, slow descent toward the horizon. Time to start heading back to base camp. But first, she wants to check one more area, a spot where she found fragments last year, where the continued melting might have exposed more. You follow her across the uneven ground, stepping carefully over rocks and patches of old snow. The landscape up here has a particular quality, not desolate exactly, but spare, stripped down to essentials. Rock, snow, water, the occasional patch of hardy vegetation clinging to sheltered spots. Everything else is just space and light, and the clean mineral smell of melting ice. The spot she's looking for is marked on her GPS, but when you reach it, there's nothing obvious to see. Just more exposed ground, more gravel and mud, more patches of old snow slowly sublimating in the thin mountain air. But she's patient, methodical. She walks a grid pattern, covering the area systematically, looking at every patch of exposed ground, every dark spot, every irregularity that might be something other than rock. And then she stops, crouches down, calls you over. It's bone. Not large, maybe 10 centimeters long, but definitely bone, not wood or stone. It's been exposed recently, probably within the past few days, based on how it's positioned and the lack of weathering on the exposed surface. The researcher photographs it, documents it, but doesn't collect it immediately. Bone requires different handling than wood or textile. It's less fragile in some ways, more fragile in others. And the presence of bone raises questions about what else might be nearby. If this is from an animal that died here, there might be more remains, might be evidence of how and why the animal died, whether it was hunted or died naturally, whether humans were involved. She marks the location with a small flag, just a piece of bright orange plastic on a wire stake, and makes detailed notes about the exact position. This will require a more thorough investigation, probably a team with expertise in faunal remains, in taphonomy, in understanding how bones are preserved and what they can reveal about the circumstances of death and deposition. The sun is definitely lower now, the light turning golden, the shadows lengthening across the snowfield. Time to head back. The researcher takes a few final photographs, recording the overall scene, the context, the way the light falls across the landscape. You start the hike back to base camp following the route you took on the way up. The descent is easier physically but requires just as much attention. The ground is uneven, the rocks loose, the patches of old snow slippery and unpredictable. As you walk, the researcher talks about the challenges of glacial archaeology. The physical demands are obvious. The hiking, the altitude, the weather, the short season. But there are also intellectual challenges, interpretive challenges. The artifacts emerging from the ice are a biased sample. They represent only what was lost or discarded, only what happened to be in places where it got covered by snow and ice, only what's being revealed in the specific areas where melting is occurring. There's no way to know what's not being found, no way to know what artifacts were lost in areas that didn't get covered by ice, that were exposed to weathering and decomposition, that vanished without a trace. No way to know what's still buried under ice that hasn't melted yet, or what's been carried downslope by glacial movement and deposited in locations where no one will think to look. So the picture being built from glacial archaeology is necessarily incomplete. It's valuable, it's informative, it changes understanding in important ways. But it's not comprehensive. It's a window, not a panorama, a glimpse, not a complete view. Still, she says, it's better than nothing. It's evidence that wouldn't exist otherwise. Without the preservation provided by the ice, these artifacts would have decomposed centuries ago. Without the warming climate causing the ice to retreat, they would remain frozen and inaccessible. The timing is narrow, the window between still frozen and exposed to decay, but it's open now, and the work is happening, and knowledge is being built that adds to human understanding of the past. You reach the base camp as evening settles in, the temperature dropping, the wind picking up. Inside the tent that serves as a field laboratory, you can see other researchers working, examining finds from earlier in the day, entering data into laptops, preparing samples for shipment back to laboratories. The textile fragment and arrow shaft will join the collection, will be cleaned and analysed and dated, and eventually published in academic journals and included in museum exhibits. They'll become data points in the larger project of understanding how people use mountain landscapes, how they adapted to changing conditions, how they moved and hunted and travelled through terrain that seems impossibly remote and harsh by modern standards, but for now they're just objects. Pieces of wood and fabric, dark and waterlogged, still carrying the cold of the ice they've been released from. waiting patiently for the next phase of analysis, the next stage in their transformation from artifacts to evidence to knowledge. The laboratory where artifacts from glacial archaeology are analysed is nothing like the mountain fieldwork. It's climate-controlled, precisely lit, equipped with microscopes and chemical testing equipment, and computers running specialised analytical software. You're visiting one of these labs, watching as a conservator works on a leather shoe that was found in a Norwegian ice patch the previous summer. The shoe is approximately 1,500 years old, dated through radiocarbon analysis of the leather itself. It's remarkably intact. The sole, the upper, even some of the stitching still visible, still holding the components together after a millennium and a half of frozen preservation. The conservator is working under magnification, examining the stitching pattern, documenting the construction technique. Each detail is noted, photographed, added to the growing database of information about this single object. The shoe is made from a single piece of leather, folded and stitched to create both the sole and the upper. The stitching is done with thread that appears to be plant fibre, possibly linden bast or nettle, materials that were commonly used for cordage in pre-modern Scandinavia. The stitches are regular and careful, showing skilled workmanship, someone who knew what they were doing and took the time to do it well. This kind of detailed construction analysis reveals more than just how the shoe was made. It reveals knowledge systems, technical traditions, the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftspeople who had figured out through trial and error what worked and what didn't. The choice of materials, the way they're prepared and joined, the patterns of wear visible on the sole. All of this is information, is evidence of choices made and challenges addressed. The conservator points out a repair visible on one side of the shoe. The leather has torn, probably from normal wear, and someone has patched it, adding a piece of material and stitching it in place. The repair is competent but not as neat as the original construction, suggesting it was done in the field, by the wearer or a companion using whatever materials were available. That repair is significant. It tells you that the shoe was valued enough to be worth repairing rather than discarding. It suggests that footwear was difficult or expensive to replace, that people took care of their equipment because getting new equipment wasn't simple or easy. It indicates that the person wearing this shoe was travelling, was away from home or a settled community where more resources might have been available for making or trading for new shoes. And then, at some point, the shoe was lost. Maybe it came off in a stream crossing. Maybe it was abandoned when it became too damaged to repair further. Maybe the person wearing it died, and the shoe was left with their body, was gradually covered by snow and ice. Whatever the circumstances, the shoe ended up in a location where it was buried by snow that compressed into ice, where it was sealed away from oxygen and bacteria and the normal processes of decay. And there it remained, perfectly preserved, until the ice melted and it reappeared on the surface, still recognizable as a shoe, still interpretable, still able to reveal information about the person who made it and the person who wore it. You watch as the conservator moves to examine the sole where wear patterns are visible. The way a shoe wears tells you something about how it was used, what kind of terrain it was walked on, whether the wearer had a particular gait or favoured one foot. This shoe shows even wear across the sole, suggesting regular use on relatively smooth ground. Trails probably, established paths where the walking was predictable. But there's also damage that looks more catastrophic. Areas where the leather is torn or abraded in ways that suggest rough terrain, scrambling over rocks, the kind of wear that comes from going off trail in difficult conditions. The picture that emerges is of someone travelling through mountains, following established routes when possible, but also willing to go cross-country when necessary. Someone who took care of their equipment but also used it hard, who needed their shoes to be functional and was willing to repair them in the field to keep them that way. Next to the shoe on the lab bench is an arrow, one of dozens recovered from Norwegian ice patches over the past 2 decades. This one is particularly well preserved. The wooden shaft complete, the sinew binding intact, even fragments of the feather fletching still attached. The conservator explains that arrows like this one were composite constructions, made from multiple components carefully fitted together. The main shaft is pine, a relatively common wood that's lightweight and straight-grained. The foreshaft, the separate front section that held the arrowhead, is made from birch, denser and more impact-resistant. The 2 pieces are joined with a socket joint, the foreshaft tapered to fit into a carved recess in the main shaft. The whole thing bound together with sinew that shrinks as it dries, creating a tight permanent connection. At the back of the shaft, the fletching is attached with more sinew binding. wrapped in a crisscross pattern that holds the feathers in place while allowing them to curve naturally, creating the aerodynamic surface that stabilizes the arrow in flight. The level of craft visible in this arrow is remarkable. Every component is carefully selected and prepared. The shaft is smoothed and balanced. The bindings are tight and regular. The fletching, though fragmentary now, shows evidence of having been trimmed and shaped to precise specifications. This wasn't a quick improvised weapon. This was a tool made by someone with expertise, someone who understood the materials and the techniques, and had probably made hundreds of similar arrows over their lifetime. The kind of knowledge that comes from apprenticeship and practice, from being part of a community where these skills were valued and passed down through demonstration and hands-on teaching. Radiocarbon dating has placed this arrow at approximately 3,400 years old, firmly in the late Bronze Age. The person who made it lived in a world without iron tools, without written records, without most of the technologies that later societies would take for granted. But they had sophisticated knowledge of materials and construction, they had effective hunting technology, and they had the confidence and capability to travel into high mountain terrain in pursuit of game. The conservator moves to a different workstation where several pieces of textile are laid out on a padded surface. These are fragments, nothing complete, but enough to show construction details. The weave is visible, the individual threads still distinct despite centuries of burial in ice. The textiles are made from wool, which makes sense for this region and time period. Sheep were common in Scandinavia, wool production was an established technology, and wool has properties that make it excellent for cold weather clothing. It insulates even when wet, it's durable, it can be woven or felted into various weights and textures. The weave pattern visible in these fragments is a simple tabby weave, the most basic form of textile construction, where warp and weft threads alternate over and under each other. It's not fancy or decorative, just functional, the kind of cloth that would be used for everyday clothing or bags or whatever needed to be made from fabric. But even this simple textile represents significant labour and knowledge. Someone had to shear the sheep, clean, and card the wool, spin it into thread, set up a loom and weave the cloth. Hours of work, probably days, to produce a piece of fabric that would then be cut and sewn into whatever was needed. And then that fabric ended up in the mountains, was lost or discarded, was covered by ice. And now it's here, in a laboratory, being examined under magnification, being documented and analysed and preserved for future study. The conservator explains that one of the challenges with glacial archaeology is conservation itself. These artefacts have been frozen for centuries or millennia. They're stable in that frozen state, but once they thaw, they become vulnerable. Organic materials start to decompose. Moisture inside the materials can cause damage as it freezes and thaws. Bacteria and fungi can begin to grow, so conservation is urgent. Artifacts need to be kept cold from the moment they're discovered until they can be properly stabilised. That usually means freeze drying, a process where the artifacts are frozen and then the ice is sublimated, converted directly from solid to gas in a vacuum chamber. This removes the moisture without allowing it to go through a liquid phase, preventing the damage that can occur when waterlogged materials dry out. After freeze drying, the artifacts are more stable, can be handled and examined more safely. But they're still fragile, still vulnerable to damage from handling, from exposure to light, from fluctuations in temperature and humidity. So they're stored in carefully controlled conditions, accessed only when necessary for study or display. The conservator shows you the storage area, a climate-controlled room where artifacts from multiple field seasons are carefully archived. Shelves hold boxes and containers, each labelled with identification numbers, dates, locations. Inside are the physical remains of past lives, shoes and arrows and textiles and tools, all recovered from melting ice, all carefully preserved and documented. It's a strange kind of museum, you think, not organised for public display, not arranged to tell a narrative, just a systematic collection of objects and information, raw material for research and understanding. But it's valuable precisely because it's systematic, because the focus is on preservation and documentation rather than presentation. These artifacts are evidence first, museum pieces second. They're here to be studied, to be analysed, to reveal information that can't be obtained any other way. The conservator pulls out one more item to show you, something different from the hunting equipment and textiles. It's a wooden ski, approximately 4,000 years old, recovered from an ice patch in northern Norway. The ski is narrow and long, carved from a single piece of pine. The top surface is flat with a slight depression near the centre where the foot would rest. The bottom surface shows careful shaping, slightly concave lengthwise to improve glide and control. Near the centre there's a foothold, a raised ridge that the foot would fit behind, held in place with a leather strap or cord. This is sophisticated snow travel technology, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to move efficiently through winter landscapes. Skis like this one allowed people to travel across snow that would be impassable on foot, to hunt, to visit neighbours, to move between settlements during months when other forms of travel were impossible. The presence of 4,000-year-old skis in Norwegian ice tells you that winter travel was not just possible but routine, that people had developed effective technologies for dealing with snow and cold, that high-latitude life was sustainable and productive even in the depths of winter. And the fact that this ski survived, was preserved in ice for 4 millennia, is a reminder of how much has been lost. For every artifact that's recovered, there are probably hundreds or thousands that decomposed without a trace. The glacial archaeology record is biased toward the exceptional, the lucky accidents of preservation, the objects that happen to end up in conditions where ice could seal them away. But even this biased, incomplete record is transforming understanding of the past. Before glacial archaeology became possible, before the ice started retreating and revealing what it had preserved, knowledge about how people lived in these environments was based mostly on inference and reconstruction. Now there's direct physical evidence, actual objects that were used by actual people, that show rather than suggest how things were done. The conservator returns the ski to its storage box, handles it with practiced care. These artifacts are irreplaceable, she reminds you. Once they're gone, they're gone. The ice that preserved them is melting, is not going to refreeze. The window for recovery is now, this generation, these few decades when the ice is retreating but hasn't disappeared entirely. After that, whatever artifacts remain buried will likely be exposed to weathering and decay. The ice will be gone, the preservation will end, and the slow process of decomposition will resume. In a century or two, most of what's currently frozen will be reduced to fragments or dust, unrecognizable and uninterpretable. So the work is urgent, not in a dramatic save-the-world sense, but in a practical, time-sensitive sense. There's a finite window, a brief period when this recovery is possible. After that, the opportunity will be gone. Back in the mountains, the researcher is conducting another survey, this time in a different area where glacial retreat has accelerated in recent years. The landscape here is more dramatic. Steep slopes, exposed rock faces, a glacier terminus that's retreated several hundred meters in the past decade. The retreat is visible in the landscape itself. The glacier sits in its valley like water in a slowly draining bathtub, its edges pulling back year by year, exposing ground that's been covered for centuries. The rock near the ice edge is freshly scoured, still showing the striations and polish left by glacial movement. Further from the ice, where the ground has been exposed longer, vegetation is starting to colonize. Mosses and lichens at first, then hardy grasses and small shrubs. This is primary succession, the slow process of biological colonization that happens when new land is exposed. It takes time, decades or centuries, for soil to develop, for plants to establish, for the full complexity of an ecosystem to emerge. But it's happening, right here, in real time, as the ice continues its retreat. The researcher is interested in a particular area near the edge of an ice patch, a location where previous surveys found fragments that suggested more might be present. The ice patch is separate from the main glacier, a remnant of accumulated snow that's been semi-permanent for as long as anyone can remember, but is now visibly shrinking year by year. Ice patches like this one are particularly important for glacial archaeology. Unlike glaciers, which flow and move and can carry objects great distances from where they were deposited, ice patches are relatively static. They accumulate snow, compress it into ice, but don't flow significantly. So artifacts found near ice patches are usually close to where they were originally lost or deposited. This makes interpretation easier. If you find an arrow near an ice patch, it was probably lost by a hunter who was using the ice patch, probably hunting reindeer or other animals that congregate on patches of old snow to escape heat and insects in summer. If you find a collection of tools, it probably indicates a hunting camp or rest stop, a place where people pause during their travels. The researcher moves carefully across the exposed ground, eyes constantly scanning. She's developed an almost instinctive sense for what might be an artifact, what shapes and colours and textures are worth investigating. Most of what she sees is natural: rocks, vegetation, the organic litter that accumulates wherever snow melts. But occasionally something stands out, something that doesn't quite fit the pattern. She stops, focuses on a dark line visible in the gravel a few metres ahead. It's straight, too straight to be a natural stick or root. She approaches carefully, crouches, examines it without touching. It's wood, definitely worked, carved smooth. Only a small section is visible above the surface, maybe 10 centimetres, but that's enough to identify it as potentially significant. She begins the documentation process, photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates, before attempting to extract it. When she does begin to excavate around the object, working carefully with a small trowel, more of it is revealed. It's a shaft, approximately a metre long, carved from a single piece of wood. One end is shaped to a blunt point. The other end has been hollowed out slightly, creating a socket that would have held another component. Based on the size and proportions, the researcher identifies it as likely a hunting spear or a ski pole. Both were common in this region historically. Both would have been made from similar materials and construction techniques. Distinguishing between them requires looking at other features: wear patterns, the shape of the socket, comparison with other known examples. She extracts the shaft carefully, supporting it as she lifts it free from the gravel. The wood is solid despite its age, the preservation excellent. Once it's out, she can examine it more closely, can see the tool marks where it was shaped, can feel the smooth surface that results from careful finishing. This object represents hours of work. Someone selected a suitable tree, cut it, stripped off the bark, shaped the wood through a combination of carving and scraping and smoothing. The result is a functional tool, well made and effective, and then it was lost. Dropped in the mountains, covered by snow, buried in the growing ice patch. And there it remained until now, until warming temperatures caused the ice to melt and the shaft to reappear on the surface. The researcher places the shaft in a padded container, adds it to the collection from this field season. She'll continue the survey, will check other areas where artefacts might be appearing, but this find alone makes the trip worthwhile. Another data point, another piece of physical evidence about how people used this landscape in the past. As the day continues, more finds emerge. A fragment of leather that might be from a shoe or bag. Several pieces of worked wood, too degraded to identify precisely but clearly anthropogenic. A bone, probably from a reindeer, showing cut marks that indicate butchering. Each find is documented, collected, added to the growing archive. The process is repetitive, methodical, but it's the only way to ensure that information is preserved, that each artifact is properly contextualized, that the data will be usable for future research. By late afternoon, the researcher has covered several square kilometres of exposed ground, has documented dozens of potential features, has collected a dozen artefacts that will be analysed back at the laboratory. It's good work, productive work, the kind of field day that justifies the effort and expense of mounting an expedition to these remote locations. But it's also bittersweet, in a way. Each artefact recovered is one that won't be destroyed by exposure to the elements. But for every artefact found, there are probably others that have been exposed, weathered, and decomposed before anyone saw them. The race between discovery and decay is ongoing, and decay doesn't take breaks, doesn't have off-seasons, doesn't require funding or permits. The ice is melting, the artefacts are appearing, and the small community of glacial archaeologists is doing what it can to document and recover what's being revealed before it's too late. The researcher packs up her equipment as the sun begins its descent. Tomorrow she'll be back. We'll cover different ground. We'll continue the systematic survey that is the backbone of glacial archaeology. But for today, the work is done, the finds are collected, and another small piece of the past has been preserved for future study. Evening at base camp finds you reviewing the day's photographs while the researchers discuss their findings over dinner. The conversation is technical but animated, focused on the details of what was found and what it might mean. The spear shaft or ski pole is generating particular interest. Its length and proportions are unusual, don't quite match other known examples from the region. The socket at one end is also distinctive, shaped in a way that suggests it was designed to hold a specific kind of attachment. One researcher thinks it might be a specialised hunting weapon, perhaps for a particular type of game. Another argues it's more likely a multi-purpose tool, something that could function as both walking stick and weapon depending on circumstances. The debate is good-natured, grounded in evidence and comparison with other known artifacts. This is how understanding develops, through careful observation, through comparison and analysis, through the gradual accumulation of data that allows patterns to emerge and interpretations to be tested. Someone mentions that a colleague in Canada has been finding similar artifacts in Yukon ice patches, evidence that the same kinds of technologies were being used across vast distances. The hunting strategies, the travel patterns, the basic approaches to surviving and thriving in high-latitude environments, these seem to have been remarkably consistent across cultures separated by thousands of kilometres. That consistency is interesting. It suggests that there are optimal solutions to certain environmental challenges, approaches that work well enough that they get independently developed or spread through cultural exchange across large regions. The composite arrow construction, for example, appears in archaeological contexts from Norway to Alaska, all dating to similar time periods, all showing the same basic design principles, even if the specific details vary. Is that independent invention, or cultural diffusion? It's hard to say, probably some combination of both. People are inventive, figure things out independently when faced with similar challenges. But people also travel, trade, share information, learn from each other. The ancient world was more connected than popular imagination often suggests. The artifacts emerging from the ice support this picture of mobility and connection. The presence of hunting equipment at high elevations indicates people were ranging widely, following game, exploring and utilising marginal environments. The presence of textiles and tools suggests trade networks, because not all materials and skills were available in all locations. Someone built the spear shaft found today, but the person who built it might not have been the same person who used it. The raw material might have come from one location, the shaping done in another, the final object traded or gifted to someone in a third location who then carried it up into the mountains where it was eventually lost. Tracing these networks, understanding these connections, is part of what makes archaeology valuable. It's not just about finding old objects, it's about reconstructing the social and economic systems that produced those objects, the human relationships and exchanges that moved materials and ideas across landscapes. The conversation shifts to broader questions about climate and adaptation. The artifacts being found in glacial ice date from periods when the climate was warmer, when ice patches were smaller or absent, when mountain routes were more easily passable. Those periods correspond to what climate scientists call the Holocene climatic optimum and the medieval warm period, times when average temperatures in the northern hemisphere were somewhat higher than in the centuries immediately before or after. During those warm periods, people adapted by expanding into marginal environments, by using high mountain passes, by developing technologies and strategies that allowed them to exploit resources in areas that were borderline habitable. They thrived, established patterns and traditions, built knowledge systems that were passed down through generations. And then the climate cooled, not catastrophically, not overnight, but gradually, persistently, over decades and centuries. The ice patches grew, the mountain passes became less reliable, more dangerous, eventually impassable. Routes that had been used for generations were abandoned. People adapted again, found different routes, adjusted their patterns, survived and continued. But the knowledge of the old routes, the specific details of how to travel through high mountain terrain, that knowledge faded, was lost, became irrelevant because the conditions that made it useful no longer existed. Until now. Until the climate shifted again, temperatures rose and the ice began to retreat. The old routes are reappearing, the artifacts are emerging, and the knowledge of how people lived and travelled in those past warm periods is becoming accessible again. It's a reminder that climate has always changed, that human societies have always adapted to changing conditions. The past offers examples of how people responded to warming, to cooling, to shifts in precipitation and seasonality. Those examples don't provide simple answers to modern challenges. The scale and rate of current climate change is unprecedented, and modern society is vastly more complex than anything in the archaeological record. But the past does provide perspective. It shows that adaptation is possible, that humans are creative and resilient, that knowledge and technology can be developed to meet new challenges. It also shows that adaptation sometimes means leaving places that become uninhabitable, that not all changes can be fully mitigated, that there are costs and losses alongside the innovations and adjustments. The researchers continue their discussion, as darkness settles over the mountains. Outside, the temperature drops, the wind picks up, and somewhere nearby the ice continues its slow retreat, millimetre by millimetre, exposing more ground, revealing more artefacts, offering more glimpses into the past. Tomorrow the work will continue, more surveys, more documentation, more careful collection and preservation of artefacts that are appearing after centuries of frozen darkness. It's patient work, unglamorous work, the kind of archaeology that happens in remote locations with minimal public attention. But it matters. It's expanding knowledge, recovering information that would otherwise be lost, building understanding about how humans have lived and adapted in challenging environments throughout history. The glacier doesn't care about any of that. It just melts, following the physics of heat transfer and phase change, responding to temperature and solar radiation, indifferent to the human meanings assigned to what it reveals. But the people doing this work care. They see value in the fragments and traces emerging from the ice. They invest time and effort in documenting and preserving what's being revealed. They ask questions and seek answers, build interpretations and test hypotheses, contribute to the collective human project of understanding where we come from and how we got here. And slowly, artifact by artifact, site by site, the picture emerges. Not complete, never complete, always fragmentary and partial, but real, grounded in physical evidence, in objects that can be held and examined, in patterns that can be documented and analysed. The past is coming back, piece by piece, as the ice releases what it has held for so long, and for this brief window, this moment when the ice is retreating but the artefacts haven't all decomposed, there's an opportunity to recover and preserve evidence that will be gone forever if it's not collected now. So the work continues. The researchers return to the mountains each summer, monitor the ice edges, search the exposed ground, document what they find. It's slow work, patient work, the kind of science that doesn't produce dramatic breakthroughs, but does produce steady accumulation of knowledge. And in laboratories and museums and archives, the artifacts are preserved, the data is organised, the patterns are analysed, papers are written, presentations given, exhibitions mounted. The information diffuses into the broader academic community, into public awareness, into the general understanding of human history and adaptation. The ice is melting, the past is emerging, and for those who know how to look, how to interpret what's being revealed, it's a remarkable time, a unique window into periods that were previously accessible only through inference and reconstruction. You're back at the site one final time before the season ends and winter returns. The snow is already starting to fall at higher elevations, dusting the peaks, beginning the process that will seal everything away again for another year. The exposed ground where artifacts were found is already partially covered with fresh snow. By next week it will probably be completely buried. The artifacts that were recovered are safe, are already in laboratories being analysed and preserved. But anything that remains undiscovered will spend another winter frozen, another season sealed beneath snow and ice. The researcher is making final documentation, taking photographs that show the site in its late season condition, noting what's visible and what's already been covered by new snowfall. These observations will be compared with next summer's survey. We'll show how the ice edge has moved, how much new ground has been exposed, what changes have occurred. It's part of the long-term monitoring that makes glacial archaeology possible. Individual finds are valuable, but patterns emerge from systematic observation over time. Seeing how quickly the ice is retreating, which areas are being exposed, what kinds of artifacts are appearing, all of this builds understanding not just of the past, but of the present process of revelation. The wind is cold, carrying flakes of snow that sting exposed skin. Winter is asserting itself, reclaiming the mountains, restoring the patterns that have dominated these landscapes for most of recent history. The brief summer window when the ground is exposed and accessible is closing. You think about cycles, about the way the landscape oscillates between frozen and thawed, accessible and sealed, revealing and concealing. The ice advanced, buried the artifacts, preserved them. The ice is retreating, exposing the artifacts, allowing them to be found. But eventually, decades from now, centuries from now, the climate will cool again, the ice will return, and what's being revealed now will be buried once more. Or maybe not. Maybe the current warming trend will continue, will accelerate, will result in the complete disappearance of these glaciers and ice patches. In that scenario, everything that's currently frozen will be exposed, will have its brief moment of accessibility before weathering and decay reduce it to nothing. Either way, this moment, this period when the ice is retreating but hasn't disappeared, is unique, unrepeatable. The window for glacial archaeology is now. In a generation or two, the window will close one way or another. Either there will be no more ice to retreat, or the ice will have advanced again, and the artifacts will be sealed away once more. The researcher takes a few final photographs, then begins packing up her equipment. It's time to head down, to close the base camp, to end the field season. Next summer, she'll be back. We'll check these same locations. We'll see what new ground has been exposed, what new artifacts have appeared. But for now, the work is done. The mountain is reclaiming its solitude, and beneath the falling snow, the ice holds what it holds, keeping its secrets until the next round of melting reveals them. You take one last look at the landscape before turning to follow the researcher down the mountain. The glacier looms above, massive and ancient, its surface crevassed and blue in the fading light. Below, the valley stretches away, already filling with evening shadow. Somewhere beneath that ice, there are probably more artifacts, more arrows and tools, more textiles and shoes, more fragments of lives lived centuries ago. Some will be revealed in coming years as the ice continues to retreat. Others will remain buried, will never be found, will be lost when the ice finally disappears and takes its remaining secrets with it. That's the nature of preservation and loss. Not everything can be saved. Not everything will be found. The glacial archaeology record will always be incomplete, always be a sampling rather than a comprehensive collection. But what has been found, what is being found each summer as the ice retreats, that's valuable beyond measure. Each artifact is a connection to the past, a tangible link to people who lived and worked and travelled in these mountains, when conditions were different, when routes that are now sealed were open, when knowledge that is now lost was current and practical. The snow is falling harder now, accumulating quickly on the exposed ground. You walk carefully, following the researcher's footsteps, making your way down to warmer elevations. Behind you, the site disappears beneath its winter blanket, hidden once again, waiting patiently for next summer when the cycle will repeat. This is how glacial archaeology happens, season by season, year by year, gradually recovering what the ice has preserved and is now releasing. It's slow work, but it's steady work. And with each passing summer, more is learned, more is understood, more pieces of the past are recovered and preserved. The ice is melting, the past is emerging. And for this brief window in geological time, humans have the opportunity to witness and document what's being revealed. You reach the lower elevations as darkness settles over the mountains. The snow is lighter here, not yet accumulating, just falling and melting, falling and melting. Above, the peaks disappear into clouds, the glacier invisible in the darkness and weather. But it's there, still retreating, still revealing, still holding artifacts that will appear next summer, or the summer after, or in years further in the future. The process continues whether anyone is watching or not, driven by climate and physics rather than human observation. But the observation matters, the documentation matters, the careful collection and preservation and analysis, all of it matters, because without it the artifacts would appear and weather away and be lost, and the information they contain would be gone forever. So the work continues, will continue next season, and the seasons after, as long as the ice keeps retreating and artifacts keep appearing. It's a unique moment in human history, this window when the past is being revealed at an unprecedented rate, when knowledge that was lost is becoming accessible again. And somewhere in that process, in the patient work of documenting and studying and interpreting what's emerging from the ice, there's a kind of quiet victory. Not over time or entropy, those forces are unstoppable, but over forgetting, over the silence that would otherwise swallow these lives and these stories. The artifacts speak if you know how to listen. They tell of people who adapted to harsh environments, who developed sophisticated technologies, who travelled and hunted and lived in places that seem impossibly remote by modern standards. They tell of resilience and ingenuity, of knowledge passed down through generations, of the fundamental human capacity to survive and even thrive in challenging conditions. And they remind us that the past is not separate from the present, that the landscapes we inhabit have been inhabited before, that the challenges we face have been faced in different forms by those who came before us. The ice is melting, the past is waking up. And for those paying attention, for those doing the patient work of documentation and preservation, it's a remarkable gift. This window into times and lives that would otherwise remain forever hidden beneath the ice. In the early decades of the 15th century, somewhere in the heart of Europe, someone sat down with fresh vellum and began to create something utterly strange. What emerged was a book filled with drawings of impossible plants, celestial diagrams that followed no known astronomy, and page after page of flowing script in an alphabet that belonged to no language anyone had ever seen. 600 years later, that book still sits in a library at Yale University, its secrets as impenetrable as the day its pages were first bound together. You're in a room where the light comes in sideways through a window with uneven glass. It's morning, probably spring, somewhere between 1400 and 1430, though the exact year doesn't particularly matter to the person sitting at the wooden table. What matters is the smoothness of the vellum beneath their fingers, the way the quill moves when the ink is exactly the right consistency, and the patience required to fill page after page with symbols that curl and loop in ways that almost look like writing. The room smells like oak gall and iron salts, the sharp tang of ink mixed with the animal smell of the prepared calfskin pages. Outside, you can hear a cart passing on a cobblestone street, the steady clop of hooves, and someone calling out about fish or bread or whatever needs selling before noon. Inside, there's just the scratch of the quill, the occasional pause to dip it again, and the soft sound of a page turning. The person making this book, and will probably never know who they were, works with the kind of attention you give to things that matter. Each character is formed deliberately, not rushed, not careless, but not precious either. This is someone who has made marks on pages before, who knows how ink behaves, and who understands that vellum is expensive and shouldn't be wasted. The writing flows in neat lines across each page, left to right, just like Latin or Italian, or any of the other languages that people wrote in back then. The symbols themselves are tidy, consistent, and pleasantly curved. They look at first glance like they should mean something, but if you could lean over this person's shoulder and try to sound out the words, you'd find yourself stuck almost immediately. The alphabet contains somewhere between 19 and 28 distinct characters, depending on whether certain variations count as separate letters or just stylistic choices. Some symbols appear constantly, showing up in almost every word. Others arrive rarely, like shy guests at a gathering. The combinations follow certain patterns. Some characters never appear at the start of words, others never show up at the end, and certain pairs seem to go together as naturally as salt and bread. The manuscript grows slowly, page by page, day by day. The writer adds illustrations, though calling them illustrations makes them sound more straightforward than they are. There are plants, or things that resemble plants, drawn with careful attention to roots and leaves and flowers. Except the roots don't quite match any real root system, and the leaves arrange themselves in ways that would make an actual plant fall over, and the flowers bloom with geometries that nature generally avoids. Some of the plants seem almost recognisable. You might glance at one and think, oh, that's probably some kind of herb. But then you notice the strange extra petals or the way the stem branches in 3 directions before spiralling back on itself. There are astronomical diagrams, wheels within wheels, covered in the same mysterious script. There are what appear to be recipes or instructions, short paragraphs of text next to stars or circles or small drawings. There are pages showing naked women in pools of green liquid, connected by an elaborate system of tubes and chambers that looks vaguely biological and vaguely architectural and vaguely like plumbing from a dream about being lost in a bathhouse designed by someone who had only heard baths described second-hand. The person creating all this doesn't seem frustrated or confused by what they're doing. They work steadily and systematically, filling about 240 pages with this strange content. Sometimes they go back and add notes in the margins. Sometimes they correct small errors or add details to drawings. It's the behaviour of someone working from knowledge, not someone making random marks to create the appearance of a book. When they finish, and we don't know if they finished what they intended or just stopped, the manuscript is bound, not expensively, but competently. The kind of binding you'd give to a book that matters, but isn't meant to impress wealthy collectors. Then it goes somewhere. Into a library maybe, onto a shelf, into whatever system of storage and organisation existed wherever this book was made. And then, for a long time, nothing much happens. Books in the 15th century don't vanish easily, but they don't exactly leave clear trails either. The Voynich manuscript, though it won't be called that for centuries, passes through hands we can only partially trace. It sits on shelves in cities whose identities we can guess at but not confirm. People own it, or at least keep it, though what they think they own remains wonderfully unclear. Sometime in the late 1500s, the manuscript surfaces in Prague. We know this because someone writes a letter about it. Georg Baresch, an alchemist living in Prague, mentions owning a book full of hieroglyphics that he can't read but finds fascinating. He's spent years staring at it, trying to work out if it contains secret knowledge about plants and stars and the natural world. He describes his relationship with the book the way you might describe living with a cat that refuses to acknowledge your existence. A mixture of genuine affection and mild resentment at being so thoroughly ignored. Baresch sends the manuscript to a Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher, who collected strange and wonderful things the way some people collect grievances. Kircher was the sort of man who believed he could decode anything, having previously convinced himself he'd translated Egyptian hieroglyphics decades before anyone actually managed that particular feat. If anyone could read this mysterious book, Baresch figured, it would be Kircher. Kircher receives the manuscript and does what scholars in the 1600s typically did with puzzling items. He stares at it for a while, writes some notes that don't help, and then files it away with all his other interesting objects. The manuscript sits in Kircher's collection at the Collegio Romano, just another curiosity in rooms full of unusual instruments, mysterious artifacts, and probably a few things that were just regular rocks that looked interesting in certain light. The book rests there for over 200 years. Not forgotten exactly, but not particularly remembered either. It becomes part of the background inventory, the kind of item that gets mentioned in catalogues with descriptions like codex containing unknown writing and botanical illustrations. Occasionally someone new would encounter it, page through it with puzzled interest, maybe make a note to investigate it properly later, and then get distracted by life's more pressing demands. When Italy unified in the late 1800s, and the Jesuit order fell on difficult times, the collection needed to be sold. Books and artifacts were boxed up, catalogued and dispersed. The manuscript ended up in a villa outside Rome, part of a larger collection purchased by the Collegio Romano from the Jesuits, stored in wooden chests that smelled of old varnish and centuries of Italian summers. This is where Wilfrid Voynich enters the story, and where the manuscript finally gets a name. You have to imagine Wilfrid Voynich as the kind of person who couldn't walk past a locked trunk without wondering what was inside. Born in Poland, a revolutionary in his youth, imprisoned in Siberia and escaped to London, married to a novelist, Voynich had transformed himself into a rare book dealer with the particular obsession of someone who had spent time in a Russian prison cell with nothing to read. He didn't just sell books, he hunted them, pursued them, and tracked them through archives and estate sales and forgotten storage rooms like a detective, following leads on a case that mattered deeply, but only to him. In 1912, Voynich found himself at the Villa Mondragone, where the Jesuit collection sat in rooms that hadn't been properly sorted in decades. He was going through chests of books, that particular combination of excited and methodical that good book dealers maintain, when he encountered something that made him stop completely. The manuscript looked old. That much was obvious from the vellum and the binding. But it was the content that grabbed him. Page after page of writing in an unknown script. Illustrations that seemed simultaneously careful and impossible. Diagrams that suggested scientific knowledge, but in a visual language he couldn't parse. Voynich had handled thousands of rare books in his career, but this was something entirely different. This was either the most significant find of his professional life, or an elaborate historical prank, and at that moment he couldn't tell which. He purchased it, along with other manuscripts from the collection, and brought it back to America. Then he did what any sensible person would do when confronted with something completely inexplicable. He showed it to everyone he could find who might have useful opinions. Voynich brought the manuscript to cryptographers, medievalists, botanists, astronomers, linguists, and anyone whose expertise might crack even a small part of the mystery. He had photographs made of the pages and distributed them to scholars across Europe and America. He wrote letters describing the manuscript's features, its apparent age, and its utterly baffling content. He was careful not to claim too much. He presented it as a genuine mystery, not as something he'd already solved. But you can feel his excitement in those letters, the thrill of owning something that resisted every attempt at understanding. The scholars responded with fascination and complete failure. Cryptographers applied every code-breaking technique they knew and found nothing that worked. Botanists looked at the plant illustrations and couldn't match them to any known species, though some seemed tantalizingly close to real plants, as if someone had drawn a daisy but given it 17 petals arranged in a spiral that nature never quite manages. Astronomers examined the celestial diagrams and found arrangements that didn't correspond to any historical understanding of the stars, though again, some elements seemed almost right, like a map of the sky drawn by someone who had heard descriptions of constellations but never actually looked up. The manuscript resisted every approach. It wasn't that scholars found clues and couldn't follow them, it was that clues kept dissolving the moment anyone looked at them directly. A pattern would emerge in the text, suggesting grammatical structure, and then immediately contradict itself on the next page. An illustration would seem to depict a known plant until you notice the impossible root system, or the flowers growing directly from the leaves. One linguist, studying the statistical patterns of the text, found that it behaved like natural language in some ways. Certain characters appeared with the right frequency, words seemed to have appropriate lengths, and the flow of text looked like writing rather than random symbols. But in other ways, it was completely wrong. Words repeated too often. Certain combinations appeared far more frequently than they should in any real language. It was like reading something that had been designed to look like language by someone who understood the general principles, but had never actually spoken or written a real sentence. Voynich died in 1930, still not knowing what his manuscript contained. His widow, Ethel, inherited it, and eventually sold it to another rare book dealer. The manuscript changed hands a few more times, each owner presumably hoping to be the one who finally solved it, before ending up at Yale University's Baedeker Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it sits today in a climate-controlled room, still refusing to explain itself. For decades, one of the basic questions about the Voynich manuscript remained unanswered. When was it actually made? Voynich and the early scholars had guessed somewhere in the 15 or 1600s based on the style of illustration and the type of vellum, but guessing and knowing are different activities entirely. In 2009, the manuscript underwent radiocarbon dating. Small samples of the vellum, pieces so tiny they barely counted as fragments, were analysed using techniques that measure the decay of carbon-14 isotopes. It's the kind of dating method that sounds more magical than it is. You're essentially counting how long it's been since the animal whose skin became these pages stopped eating grass and breathing air, and engaging in all the other activities that incorporate trace amounts of radioactive carbon into living tissue. The results came back placing the vellum between 1404 and 1438, with the most likely date around 1420. This was older than many scholars had expected, pushing the manuscript back into the early Renaissance, a time when the world was just starting to transition from medieval manuscripts to printed books. But here's the thing about radiocarbon dating vellum. You're dating when the animal died, not when someone wrote on its skin. Vellum was expensive, and it wasn't unusual for scribes to stockpile it, letting prepared pages sit for years or even decades before using them, so the manuscript could have been created any time after 1420. It could have been made in 1421, or 1460, or 1500. The vellum gives us a starting point, not an ending one. The ink, frustratingly, can't be dated with the same precision. The pigments used for the illustrations contain materials that exist in too many time periods to narrow things down. Medieval ink was often made from oak galls, iron salts, and water, ingredients that don't change much across centuries. Without unique chemical signatures, the ink just tells us that it's old, which we already knew from looking at it. What the dating did confirm was that this wasn't a 19th century forgery created to fool collectors, which had been one persistent theory. The manuscript was genuinely old, genuinely medieval, and genuinely made before printing presses turned books into reproducible objects. Someone in the early 1500s really had sat down and filled these pages with undecipherable script and impossible plants and astronomical diagrams that didn't match the sky. This knowledge somehow made the manuscript more mysterious, not less. A modern fake would have been disappointing but understandable. People forge things for money or fame or the simple pleasure of fooling experts. But a genuine medieval manuscript in an unknown language suggested something stranger. That someone 600 years ago possessed knowledge or beliefs or intentions that we still can't fathom, despite all our computational power and linguistic databases and collective scholarly attention. The manuscript wasn't made as a joke for future generations to puzzle over. It was created for some purpose, by someone, in a world where vellum was valuable and time was limited, and making a 240-page book required genuine commitment. Whatever its purpose was, it mattered enough to justify months of careful work. One of the most persistent questions about the Voynich manuscript is whether the text represents actual language at all. Not which language, or what it says, but whether the symbols encode meaning in the way that writing normally does, where specific sounds or concepts attach to specific marks, allowing thought to travel from one mind to another across time and distance. The text looks like language. This seems worth emphasising because it's easy to gloss over just how convincingly language-like it appears. The symbols flow in consistent directions. They arrange themselves into discrete words separated by small spaces. The words vary in length, but cluster around patterns you'd expect in real text. Mostly short words, fewer medium words, and occasional long words. Certain symbols appear more frequently than others, following what linguists call Zipf's law, a statistical pattern that shows up in virtually every human language where common words appear much more often than rare ones. If you chart the frequency of symbols in the Voynich text against the frequency of letters in, say, English or Latin or Italian, you get distributions that look remarkably similar. The most common symbol appears about twice as often as the second most common symbol, which appears about twice as often as the third, and so on down the line. This isn't what you'd get from random marks or decorative patterns. This is the signature of structured information. But then you look closer, and things start seeming wrong in ways that are hard to articulate at first. Words repeat far more often than they should. Some words appear 2 or 3 times in a single line, or start consecutive sentences, or show up dozens of times on a single page. Real languages don't typically behave this way. You might say the frequently in English, but you rarely write the unless you're being deliberately strange or discussing the word itself. The manuscript also shows a peculiar lack of variation in word length within individual sections. Pages of the botanical section will contain mostly short words of 3 or 4 characters. Pages of the astronomical section will suddenly shift to longer words of 7 or 8 characters. It's as if different parts of the manuscript follow different rules, or as if the writer was adjusting some underlying system to match the subject matter. Even stranger, words in the manuscript seem to follow strict patterns about which symbols can appear in which positions. Certain characters only show up at the beginning of words, others only appear at the end. Some combinations never occur, as if there's a grammar to the writing that prohibits certain arrangements. This happens in real languages too. English doesn't allow words to start with ng, for instance, but the manuscript takes it to an extreme. It's almost too organised, too systematic, as if someone built a language-like system with very rigid rules and then followed those rules absolutely. Linguists have fed the text into computer programs that analyse statistical patterns in writing. These programs can usually identify what language something is written in, even if they can't translate it. by recognizing characteristic patterns in how symbols combine and arrange. The Voynich text confuses these programs completely. It shows features of language but doesn't match any known language family. It has structure but not the kind of structure that natural languages evolved to have. Some researchers have suggested it might be an early attempt at creating an artificial language, a philosophical language, of the sort that became popular in the 1600s, where symbols represented concepts rather than sounds. Others think it might be an extremely unusual cipher, where the encoding process somehow created these strange statistical properties. Still others believe it could be glossolalia, invented words that follow unconscious patterns without actually meaning anything, like speaking in tongues but written down with meticulous care. The most frustrating possibility is that it might be all and none of these things simultaneously. Perhaps it's a system that uses elements of natural language, elements of code, and elements of invented structure, combined in ways that create something that looks tantalizingly meaningful, while actually encoding nothing at all. Or perhaps it encodes information in such an unusual way that we keep looking right past the meaning because we're expecting writing to behave like writing normally behaves. You can spend hours staring at a page of Voynich text and your brain will insist it should make sense. The symbols are too regular, too carefully formed and too systematically arranged to be nonsense. But then you try to find patterns, and the patterns dissolve. You think you've spotted a repeated word that might be important, and then you realise it appears in contexts that seem completely unrelated. You notice that certain symbols almost always appear together, and then you find a page where they never appear together at all. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces fit together perfectly, but the resulting image doesn't depict anything recognisable. Everything clicks into place. Nothing makes sense. If you're the kind of person who enjoys botanical illustration, the Voynich manuscript will delight and frustrate you in equal measure. The plant drawings demonstrate genuine skill and careful observation. Roots spread in convincing tangles. Leaves show proper venation patterns. Flowers display the kind of detailed structure that suggests someone looked at actual plants before putting pen to page. But then you try to identify any of them, and you discover that none quite exist. There are plants that resemble sunflowers, except the petals are wrong, and the leaves grow from impossible locations on the stem. There are plants that look vaguely like various species of morning glory, but with root systems that belong to completely different families. One illustration appears to show something related to the water lily, but the flowers emerge from a geometric arrangement that no real water lily has ever achieved. Botanists have spent decades trying to match these drawings to known species. Every so often, someone announces they've identified one. This illustration is clearly a European variety of some herb, or that drawing definitely represents a particular type of Mediterranean wildflower. But then other botanists look at the same illustration and point out all the features that don't match, all the impossible combinations of characteristics that would never appear in a single plant. The problem is that each illustration contains multiple features that are almost right. You'll have a root that looks exactly like it belongs to one plant family, attached to a stem that's clearly from a different family, topped with flowers from yet another family entirely. It's as if someone took a botanical knowledge of European plants and then deliberately scrambled the characteristics, creating new impossible combinations that look plausible at first glance, but fall apart under scrutiny. Some researchers have suggested that the plants might be stylized representations, simplified drawings that capture essential features while ignoring others. Medieval and Renaissance botanical illustration often took liberties with accuracy in favour of recognizability or symbolic meaning. But even allowing for stylization, the Voynich plants are too consistently wrong in too many specific ways. They're not simplified versions of real plants. They're carefully detailed illustrations of plants that don't exist. Another theory proposes that these might be plants from other regions, exotic species that European botanists in the 1500s wouldn't have recognised. Perhaps the manuscript was created somewhere in Asia or the Americas, depicting local flora that would have seemed utterly foreign to European eyes. The problem with this theory is that botanists have now catalogued plants from across the globe, and none of them match the Voynich illustrations any better than European species do. If these plants exist somewhere, they've hidden themselves remarkably well. The most unsettling possibility is that the plants are purely invented, drawn by someone with enough botanical knowledge to make them seem plausible, but no interest in depicting reality. Perhaps they're meant to represent alchemical concepts or medical theories, with each impossible plant encoding some kind of symbolic meaning that made sense within whatever system of knowledge the manuscript represents. Or, and this is the thought that creeps in when you're looking at these drawings late at night, perhaps they're meant to depict plants that once existed but don't anymore, lost species, extinct varieties, and things that grew in gardens that vanished centuries ago. It's almost certainly not true, but the illustrations are detailed enough, convincing enough, that part of your brain wants to believe these plants were real, that someone drew them from life, that somewhere in the early 1500s, a garden contained flowers that bloomed in impossible spirals and herbs with root systems that defied botanical logic. The drawings also include what appear to be pharmaceutical or recipe sections, showing these same impossible plants being processed, roots being extracted, leaves being prepared, everything illustrated with the same careful attention to detail that makes you think the person drawing this knew exactly what they were depicting, even if nobody since has figured it out. The astronomical and astrological sections of the manuscript present their own special category of confusion. There are circular diagrams showing what appear to be zodiac symbols, except they don't quite match any traditional zodiac. There are charts that might represent lunar phases or planetary movements, except the geometry doesn't correspond to how celestial bodies actually move through the sky. Some of the diagrams are beautiful in that particularly medieval way, where function and decoration blur together. Wheels within wheels, all covered in the mysterious script, with small illustrations of stars or suns or celestial objects scattered throughout. They look like they should represent some sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the kind of careful observation and mathematical understanding that was developing in the 1500s as scholars began to question old models of the heavens. But when astronomers analyse these diagrams, they can't match them to any known system of celestial mapping. The number of divisions in the wheels doesn't correspond to months or zodiac signs or lunar phases in any standard way. The symbols, while beautiful, don't match any astronomical notation from any culture that we know of. It's as if someone created a completely new system for tracking the movements of heavenly bodies, one that runs parallel to actual astronomy without ever quite intersecting with it. One section contains what appears to be a zodiac wheel, with figures that might represent zodiacal signs. You can make out shapes that could be fish or rams or human figures. But there are the wrong number of them, and they're arranged in an order that doesn't match any traditional zodiac sequence. It's like looking at a familiar constellation pattern that's been rotated and stretched until it's almost but not quite recognisable. The manuscript also includes what appear to be star charts or celestial maps, pages covered in small symbols that could represent stars connected by lines that might indicate constellations. Except again, they don't match any constellations that actually appear in the night sky, at least not from any location or time period that astronomers have been able to identify. They're too organised to be random, too systematic to be decorative, but too wrong to be accurate. Some researchers have suggested these might represent astrological rather than astronomical knowledge, not attempting to map the actual sky, but rather depicting symbolic relationships between celestial influences and earthly events. Medieval and Renaissance astrology often used complex diagrams to show how planetary positions affected human health, personality, and fate. The Voynich astronomical sections could be illustrating some system of astrological medicine or cosmic influence that doesn't match standard Western astrology, but might have made perfect sense within whatever intellectual framework produced the manuscript. The problem, as with everything in this manuscript, is that we're stuck interpreting without context. We see wheels and circles and what appear to be calendrical markers, and we recognise them as the kind of thing that usually represents time and celestial movement. We can't decode the manuscript's meaning without knowing its system and its assumptions about the cosmos. It's a bit like finding a clock from an alternate universe where time is measured differently. You can recognise that it's a timekeeping device. You can see that it has systematic divisions and markings, but you can't use it to tell time because you don't know what the numbers mean or how they correspond to the passage of hours. And then there are the bathing women, which might be the manuscript's stranger section, and that's saying something given the competition. Pages and pages show small naked female figures, drawn with economical lines and minimal detail, sitting in what appears to be water, or possibly some kind of liquid that the illustrator coloured green. The women are connected by an elaborate network of tubes and channels that flow between pools and vessels and chambers. It looks vaguely biological, vaguely architectural, and vaguely like a medieval diagram of the circulatory system crossed with a bathhouse, crossed with some kind of alchemical apparatus. The women themselves are drawn simply, almost schematically. They're not individualised portraits, but rather generic figures used to populate this strange landscape of connected pools. Some sit alone in circular vessels, others cluster together in larger chambers. The tubes connecting them branch and merge in ways that suggest flow and circulation, as if whatever liquid fills these pools is meant to move through the system in some meaningful pattern. Scholars have proposed numerous interpretations. Perhaps it's a diagram of balneological therapy, representing medieval theories about the healing properties of different kinds of baths. Perhaps it's an alchemical allegory, with the women representing different substances or stages in some transformation process. Perhaps it's astronomical or astrological, with each pool representing a celestial body and the women standing in for planetary influences. Or perhaps it's gynecological, depicting medieval understanding of female anatomy and reproduction in symbolic form. There are elements that could suggest this. The branching tubes might represent fallopian tubes or blood vessels, and the chambers might represent organs or bodily cavities. Medieval medical texts often used elaborate diagrams to explain reproduction and fetal development, and they frequently employed visual metaphors that seem bizarre to modern eyes. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The section is so unique, so different from anything in other medieval manuscripts that there's no good comparative material to work from. It's not that scholars can't think of interpretations, they can think of dozens. It's that none of the interpretations can be proven or disproven without being able to read the text that accompanies these illustrations. What makes this section particularly dreamlike is how calmly systematic it is. The women aren't engaged in any activity, they're just sitting in their pools, connected by their tubes, existing within this elaborate system that somebody carefully designed and illustrated. There's something both peaceful and unsettling about it, this vision of bodies linked together in green water, circulating through a structure whose purpose remains entirely opaque. If you stare at these pages long enough, and you probably shouldn't because it starts affecting your dreams, you begin to notice small details. Some women hold small objects, some pools are marked with stars or symbols, some tubes branch in complex patterns, while others run straight and simple. It all seems intentional, purposeful, as if each small variation means something within the overall system. But what that something is remains as mysterious as everything else in this endlessly puzzling book. For cryptographers, the Voynich manuscript represents either the ultimate puzzle or the ultimate disappointment, depending on whether they think it's actually encoded information or just an elaborate collection of meaningless symbols arranged to look significant. Professional codebreakers have been attacking this manuscript for over a century now, applying every technique from medieval ciphers to modern computational analysis. They've tried treating it as a substitution cipher, where each symbol represents a different letter. They've tried polyalphabetic ciphers, where the encoding system changes throughout text. They've tried treating it as a code, where symbols represent whole words or concepts rather than individual letters. They've tried assuming it's written in a known language that's been encoded, and they've tried assuming it's an unknown language written plainly. Nothing has worked. Not even close. The fundamental problem is that the text has statistical properties that don't match encrypted natural language. When you encrypt a message using classical cipher techniques, the underlying structure of the original language usually shows through in various ways. Letter frequencies might be disguised, but word lengths, grammatical patterns, and other features often remain detectable. The Voynich text doesn't show these characteristics, but it also doesn't show the characteristics of random gibberish or meaningless decoration. It's too structured, too internally consistent, and too carefully organised. Truly random arrangements of symbols wouldn't display the kinds of patterns that the Voynich text contains, the way certain symbols cluster together, the way words seem to have grammatical positions, and the way the whole thing gives the appearance of systematic writing. This has led some cryptographers to suggest that if the manuscript is encoded, it must be using an extremely unusual cipher system, something that wouldn't become common until centuries after the manuscript was created. Perhaps some kind of double or triple encoding where the text was encrypted. Then the encrypted text was encrypted again using a different system, creating something so thoroughly obscured that standard cryptanalysis techniques can't penetrate it. The counter-argument is that if someone in the early 1500s had developed such a sophisticated encryption system, one that still defeats modern computer analysis, they would have been a cryptographic genius far ahead of their time. And yet we have no other evidence of such advanced cipher work from that period. It requires assuming someone invented encryption techniques that wouldn't be developed for several more centuries, used them to encode a manuscript, and then the knowledge of how they did it completely vanished from history. Some codebreakers have approached the manuscript by trying to work backward from the assumption that certain symbols must represent common words or letter combinations. If you could find a symbol that means the, and, or another common word, you could decode more of the text. The problem is that every time someone thinks they've identified a meaningful symbol or pattern, they apply it to the rest of the manuscript and it falls apart immediately. What seems to work on one page fails completely on the next. There's also the question of whether the manuscript contains one text or multiple texts. Different sections use slightly different symbol frequencies and word patterns. It's possible that different parts were written by different people, or using different encoding systems, or perhaps even in different languages. If the manuscript is a compilation of several different texts, each encoded differently, then trying to find a single decryption key would be futile. You'd need multiple keys, and you'd need to know where each one applied. The most frustrating scenario for cryptographers would be if the manuscript isn't actually encoded at all. If the symbols don't represent anything linguistic, but rather some other kind of information entirely. Perhaps it's a musical notation, or a mnemonic system for memorizing other texts, or a representation of something we haven't even thought to consider. In that case, all the cryptographic analysis is fundamentally misdirected, trying to decode something that was never meant to be read as text in the first place. One persistent theory is that the Voynich manuscript is simply a hoax, an elaborate fake created to fool collectors or scholars, or perhaps just to amuse its creator. This theory has the advantage of explaining why nobody can read the text. There's nothing to read, just meaningless symbols arranged to look important. The problem with the hoax theory is that creating this particular hoax would have required an absurd amount of work for uncertain reward. Remember, the vellum dates to the early 1500s, so if this is a fake, it's a fake from the Renaissance era, not something created in the 19th century to fool collectors. Someone in the 1400s or 1500s would have needed to obtain over 200 pages of expensive vellum, spend months carefully writing out 40,000 words of invented text, while maintaining consistent statistical patterns, create detailed botanical illustrations of impossible plants, draw astronomical diagrams that look meaningful without depicting anything real, and illustrate sections showing complex systems of pools and tubes and women bathing. All of this for what purpose? Vellum was valuable. Time was valuable. The skills required to create a book like this, writing, illustration, binding, were professional skills that people normally use to earn a living. Creating the Voynich manuscript as a meaningless joke would be like someone today spending 5 years building an elaborate sculpture out of solid gold and then burying it in their backyard where nobody would ever see it. If it was intended to fool someone, to be sold as a valuable medieval text containing secret knowledge, then it seems to have failed at that goal for several centuries. It changed hands a few times, but doesn't seem to have commanded enormous prices or fooled major collectors. Georg Beresch owned it in the 1600s and tried to get it translated, suggesting he genuinely believed it contained meaningful information rather than knowing it was fake. If someone created it as a commercial fraud, the fraud was remarkably unsuccessful. Some researchers have suggested it might be a hoax in a different sense, not meant to fool others for money, but created as a kind of intellectual game or thought experiment. Perhaps someone wanted to see if they could create something that looked like it contained deep knowledge while actually being empty of content. A meditation on the nature of meaning and meaninglessness, written 600 years ago by someone who never expected anyone to spend centuries trying to decode it. But even this seems like an odd amount of effort for what would essentially be a private joke. The manuscript is too carefully made, too systematic in its construction, and too consistent across its many pages. It shows signs of being a serious work, not a frivolous one. The hoax theory also struggles to explain certain features of the text. If someone was just making up random symbols to look like language, you'd expect more variation, more randomness, and fewer of the subtle patterns that linguists and cryptographers keep finding. The statistical structure of the text suggests either natural language or an extremely sophisticated artificial system. Creating that kind of structure accidentally, just by randomly making up symbols, would be nearly impossible. So if it's a hoax created by someone with deep knowledge of how language works, who took enormous care to make their fake text display properties of real writing, who spent months or years on this project for no clear reward, and who then let it disappear into obscurity for centuries rather than trying to profit from it or take credit for their achievement, which isn't impossible. People do strange things for strange reasons, but it requires assuming motivations and behaviours that seem at odds with how people usually operate, then and now. When computers became powerful enough to analyse large amounts of text, researchers naturally turned them loose on the Voynich manuscript. Finally they thought, we have tools that can detect patterns humans might miss, statistical relationships too subtle for manual analysis, and connections between the text and the illustrations that could unlock everything. The computers found patterns. Many patterns. Too many patterns, really. And none of them led anywhere. Computational linguists fed the text into programs designed to identify language families. The programs reported that the manuscript's text showed characteristics similar to various natural languages, but didn't match any of them closely enough to make a definitive identification. Some analyses suggested it might be related to Southeast Asian languages. Others pointed toward Germanic or Romance language features. Still others indicated it could be an artificial language created from scratch. Researchers applied machine learning algorithms, training computers to recognize patterns in how symbols combine and arrange themselves. The algorithm successfully learned the manuscript's patterns and could even generate new Voynich-like text that looked convincingly similar to the original. But they couldn't explain what those patterns meant or how they related to actual information. One approach tried using the illustrations as a key to the text. If you could identify what the plant illustration showed, you might be able to match the accompanying text to plant names or botanical descriptions in known languages. The problem, as we've seen, is that the plants don't match anything identifiable, so this approach quickly dead-ended. Another technique involved analysing the physical structure of the manuscript, the order of pages, the way sections were bound together, and any evidence of pages being removed or rearranged. The goal was to reconstruct the manuscript's original structure, on the theory that understanding the intended organisation might reveal something about its purpose. This research confirmed that the manuscript's current page order is probably close to its original organisation, but didn't really clarify what that organisation meant. Some researchers have used computer analysis to identify different hands in the writing, looking for subtle variations that might indicate different writers or different time periods. The results are inconclusive. The writing is remarkably consistent throughout most of the manuscript, but there are sections that show slight variations in symbol formation or spacing. Whether these represent different writers, the same writer at different times, or just natural variation in handwriting remains debatable. The digital age has also made it easier to compare the Voynich manuscript to other medieval texts, looking for stylistic similarities or shared features that might provide context. Researchers have identified a few manuscripts with superficially similar illustration styles, and a few with comparable organisational structures, but nothing that offers a genuine understanding of what the Voynich text actually represents. In recent years, people have tried using artificial intelligence and neural networks, the same kinds of systems that can translate between languages or generate human-like text. The AI systems can learn to imitate the manuscript's statistical patterns, but they can't translate it or explain it any better than earlier approaches. They're just better at producing convincing nonsense that looks like the original. What the computer age has really done is confirm how deeply strange the manuscript is. Every new analytical technique reveals more patterns, more structure, and more evidence that these aren't just random marks on a page. But the patterns don't assemble into meaning. The structure doesn't reveal purpose. It's as if the manuscript exists in a category of its own, not quite language, and not quite non-language, not quite encrypted and not quite plain text, not quite coherent and not quite incoherent. The digital tools have also made the manuscript more accessible. High-resolution scans are freely available online. Anyone with internet access can examine every page, zoom in to see individual pen strokes and study the illustrations in detail. This democratization of access has led to thousands of amateur attempts at decipherment, new theories proposed every year, and clever people convinced they've spotted something everyone else missed. And they might have. That's the maddening thing about the Voynich manuscript. The solution could be obvious, something everyone keeps overlooking because they're approaching it wrong. Or it could be genuinely unsolvable because there's nothing to solve. The manuscript sits there, the same as it has for 600 years, perfectly willing to be examined but entirely unwilling to explain itself. There's something about the Voynich manuscript that captures certain minds and doesn't let go. People discover it, start examining it, and then find themselves still thinking about it years later, unable to completely abandon the puzzle, even when logic suggests they should move on to more productive obsessions. Some of these people are professional academics with relevant expertise, linguists, cryptographers, medieval historians who encounter the manuscript as part of their research and then get pulled deeper than they intended. They'll spend a summer analysing one section, planning to publish a brief paper and move on, and then find themselves still working on it a decade later, their office walls covered with enlarged illustrations and statistical charts showing symbol frequencies. Others are enthusiastic amateurs, people with no formal training in cryptography or medieval studies, but with good pattern recognition skills and a stubborn refusal to accept that something this carefully constructed can't be understood. They spend evenings and weekends studying the text, developing elaborate theories, and writing long analyses that they share online or send to universities, convinced they're one insight away from cracking the whole thing. The manuscript attracts a particular kind of obsessive attention because it seems simultaneously accessible and impossible. You don't need specialised equipment to study it, just the images, freely available online, and your own analytical ability. It looks like it should yield to careful examination. The symbols are clear, the illustrations are detailed, and the structure is apparent. Unlike many historical mysteries that require rare access or expensive research, the Voynich manuscript sits there fully visible, inviting anyone to take a shot at decoding it. And then it defeats everyone. Professional cryptographers with decades of experience, computational linguists with sophisticated software, and amateur codebreakers who've successfully decoded other historical ciphers, they all hit the same wall. The manuscript absorbs their analytical attention without surrendering its secrets. This pattern has repeated for over a century now. Someone announces they've solved it. They've identified the language, or cracked the cipher, or recognised what the plants represent, or understood the astronomical diagrams. They publish their findings, sometimes in academic papers, sometimes in blog posts or self-published books. Other researchers examine their work and point out the flaws. The translation only works for a few words before breaking down, or the cipher system they've proposed doesn't match the statistical properties of the text, or their plant identifications require ignoring most of the features of the illustrations. The person who proposed the solution might defend it for a while, arguing that the critics are missing something, that their approach is more sophisticated than it appears, and that the problems are actually evidence of multiple encoding systems or deliberate obfuscation. Sometimes they'll revise their theory, adjusting it to account for the criticisms. More often, their solution quietly fades away, joining the hundreds of other proposed decodings that seemed promising until they didn't. What's interesting is how few people become bitter about this. You'd expect frustration and resentment at wasting time on an impossible puzzle, but many researchers who've spent years working on the manuscript speak about it with a kind of affection, the way you might talk about a difficult friend who enriches your life despite being frustrating. The manuscript has given them a puzzle worth solving, a mystery that remains genuinely mysterious in an age when most things can be Googled in seconds. There's also a community aspect to it. People working on the Voynich manuscript find each other online, share theories, critique each other's approaches, and collaborate on analysis. They attend conferences where they present their latest findings to others who understand why this particular medieval book matters so much. For some, the manuscript becomes a lifelong intellectual companion, a problem they return to whenever they need something genuinely challenging to think about. And occasionally, someone does make real progress, not solving the whole thing, but identifying something new, a statistical pattern nobody had noticed, a possible connection to another medieval text, a detail in the illustrations that provides context. These small discoveries don't crack the manuscript wide open, but they add to the collective understanding, making the mystery slightly more defined even if no closer to being solved. The manuscript has also inspired creative works, novels that imagine its origin story, artworks that remix its illustrations, and music based on its mysterious symbols. It's become a cultural object beyond just being a historical artifact, a symbol of the unknowable that resonates with anyone who appreciates a good mystery. After 600 years and countless attempts at understanding, what can we say with certainty about the Voynich manuscript? We know it's old, created sometime after 1404, when the animals who provided the vellum were alive, and probably not much later than the mid-1500s based on various contextual clues. We know it consists of roughly 40,000 words in an unknown script, accompanied by illustrations that don't match any known plants, astronomical systems, or symbolic traditions. We know it was created by someone with genuine skill in writing and illustration. The text is too consistent to be random marks, and the drawings show real artistic ability. We know it was carefully made, with attention to detail and consistent effort across many pages. We know it wasn't a quick project, but something that required significant time and resources. We know that whatever system it uses for encoding information, if it does encode information, is unlike any cipher or language that cryptographers and linguists have successfully identified. We know that people in the past took it seriously enough to preserve it, trade it, and try to understand it. We know that it ended up in collections of interesting and valuable books, rather than being discarded as obvious nonsense. We know that modern computational analysis has found patterns in the text that suggest structure and organisation, but hasn't been able to match those patterns to any known language or cipher system. We know that the illustrations, while impossible to definitively identify, show enough detail to suggest they're depicting something specific, rather than being purely decorative or random. What we don't know vastly outweighs what we do know. We don't know who created it, or where, or exactly when or why. We don't know if it's written in a natural language, an artificial language, or any kind of language at all. We don't know if it's encrypted, and if so, using what method. We don't know what the text says, what the plants represent, what the astronomical diagrams map, or what the bathing women signify. We don't know if it contains valuable knowledge, complete nonsense, or something in between. We don't know if it was meant to be read by others or was a private project never intended for outside eyes. We don't know if the solution is simple and we're just missing it, or genuinely complex or impossible because there's nothing to solve. This vast landscape of unknowing is, in its own way, remarkable. In the 21st century, with all our analytical tools and accumulated historical knowledge and computational power, this medieval manuscript remains fundamentally mysterious. It sits in its climate-controlled room at Yale, available for anyone to examine, and continues to keep its secrets. There's something almost comforting about this. In a world where most questions can be answered with a quick search, where mysteries get solved by crowds of online investigators, where privacy is increasingly difficult and knowledge seems endlessly accessible, the Voynich manuscript reminds us that some things still resist understanding, not because they're hidden or protected, but because they exist in a category we haven't quite learned to recognise. Maybe it will be solved someday. Maybe some researcher will stumble on the right approach, or some new technology will reveal something we've been missing, or some historical discovery will provide the context needed to understand what we're looking at. Maybe tomorrow, or next year, or in 50 years, someone will publish a definitive decoding, and the manuscript will finally give up its secrets. Or maybe it won't. Maybe it will sit there for another 600 years, outlasting our current civilization, still waiting for someone who can read it, or still guarding nothing more than the appearance of meaning. It's late now, and you're thinking about a book made 600 years ago by someone whose name you'll never know. You're imagining them in that room with sideways light, carefully forming each symbol, adding each illustration, working day after day on a project whose purpose remains completely opaque to everyone who's examined it since. What were they thinking? Did they know they were creating something that would baffle generations of scholars? Or were they simply doing work that made perfect sense to them, following a system so clear in their own mind that they never imagined it would become incomprehensible? Maybe they were recording knowledge they considered valuable. Botanical information, astronomical observations and medical theories. Maybe they were encoding secrets they needed to protect. Maybe they were constructing an elaborate thought experiment about the nature of language and meaning. Maybe they were just filling time, creating something beautiful and complex because the act of creation itself was satisfying. You'll never know. Neither will anyone else, probably. The manuscript exists as a bridge that connects you to someone 600 years ago, but it's a bridge you can't quite cross. You can see evidence of their careful work, their systematic approach, and their commitment to this project. But you can't hear them explain what they were doing or why it mattered. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything needs to be understood to be valuable. Maybe the manuscript's greatest contribution is this reminder that mystery can persist, that careful work can create effects that outlast understanding, and that something made with attention and purpose can continue to command attention, even when that purpose remains hidden. The person who made this book is gone. The world they lived in, where vellum was valuable, and books were rare, and whatever knowledge system the manuscript represents made sense, is gone too. But the book remains, physical and present, its pages still intact, its symbols still carefully formed, its illustrations still detailed and impossible. It sits in its library, patient and inscrutable, the same now as it was 600 years ago. Still complex, still structured, still carefully organised, still completely mysterious. Still offering itself to anyone who wants to examine it, and still refusing to explain itself to anyone who does. You could spend your whole life studying it. Some people have. You could develop elaborate theories about what it means, run sophisticated analysis on its statistical properties, and compare it to every other medieval text you can find. You could become an expert on this one specific manuscript, knowing more about its physical properties and visual features than almost anyone alive, and you still wouldn't know what it says. You'd be in the same position as Georg Barisch in his house in Prague 400 years ago, staring at symbols that seem like they should mean something, feeling certain that meaning is there somewhere, and being completely unable to access it. But you'd have spent your time with something genuinely strange, something that doesn't fit into easy categories, something that has successfully resisted explanation despite centuries of intelligent people trying to understand it. You'd have lived with a real mystery, not a puzzle designed to be solved, or a riddle with an answer hiding in plain sight, but something that might not have an answer at all, or might have an answer so far outside normal categories of thinking that it remains invisible despite being right there on the page. The Voynich manuscript isn't going anywhere. It will sit in its library, outlasting all of us, still mysterious, still carefully made, still impossible to read, still offering that strange combination of accessibility and inscrutability that has made it fascinating to so many people for so long, still keeping its secrets, if it has any, still looking like meaning even if it contains none, still waiting, patient and silent, the way books do for someone who might understand, or not, sleep well, dream of impossible plants growing in forgotten gardens, of stars arranged in patterns that don't match the sky, of symbols that flow like language across pages of 600-year-old vellum. Dream of a mystery that persists not because it's hidden, but because it exists in a shape we haven't learned to recognize. The manuscript will still be there in the morning, exactly as mysterious as it's been all along. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. You are drifting back to a time when the Aegean Sea cradled hundreds of islands, and the people who lived there shaped their understanding of the world through story, stone, and the slow turning of seasons. Here, across warm waters and sunlit shores, memory and landscape became quietly inseparable, and the earth beneath their feet held stories that would echo for thousands of years. You wake before dawn in a small coastal settlement, where the first light touches whitewashed walls and the smell of the sea drifts through open doorways. Your neighbours are already moving, their footsteps soft on packed earth as they make their way toward the harbour. This is how most mornings begin. There is bread to bake, nets to mend, and boats to prepare. The rhythm is familiar, shaped by tides and weather, by the seasons that dictate when to plant and when to harvest. The island where you live is one of many scattered across the Aegean, each with its own character but all sharing the same dependence on the sea. Fishing provides much of what your community needs. Men and women work together to haul in the day's catch, sorting through silvery fish that will be salted, dried, or traded. Children help carry baskets, learning the work by watching and imitating. There is no rush, only the steady pace of hands that know their task well. Inland, farmers tend terraced fields where barley and lentils grow in soil enriched by centuries of careful cultivation. The terraces follow the contours of the hillside, each level supported by low stone walls built by hands that understood how to work with the land rather than against it. Olive trees dot the slopes, their twisted trunks and silvery leaves a constant presence. Harvesting olives is a communal effort, families gathering to shake the branches and collect the fruit in woven baskets. The oil pressed from these olives will light lamps, flavour food, and serve as currency in trades with neighbouring islands. Trade itself is woven into the fabric of daily life. Small boats move between islands, carrying goods that each community produces in abundance. Pottery from one island is exchanged for wine from another. Obsidian, prized for its sharp edge, travels from volcanic islands to places where such stone is rare. Textiles woven from wool and dyed with plants or shellfish find their way into distant markets. These exchanges are not merely transactions, but relationships, bonds formed over shared meals and repeated visits that span generations. Your home is modest. built from stone and clay with a flat roof that can be used for drying fruit or sleeping on warm nights. Inside, storage jars hold grain, oil and water. A hearth anchors the central room, its fire tended carefully throughout the day. Cooking is simple but sufficient. Bread, fish, vegetables, cheese and fruit make up most meals. Honey sweetens special occasions. Wine, diluted with water, accompanies gatherings. Life moves in cycles you can anticipate. Spring brings planting and the return of migrating birds. Summer means long days of work under a bright sun, followed by evenings spent outdoors where breezes cool the air. Autumn is harvest time, when the fruits of the year's labour are gathered and stored. Winter brings quieter days, time for repair and craft, for weaving and tool-making, for the stories that hold your community's memory. Religious observance is part of this rhythm too, though it feels less like ceremony and more like acknowledgement. Small shrines dot the landscape, places where offerings are left to honour the forces that govern your world. A bit of grain poured onto the ground, a cup of wine spilled into the sea, flowers placed on a stone altar. These gestures are simple, a way of maintaining balance with the world around you. Neighbours know each other well. Disputes are settled through discussion, often with the guidance of elders whose experience commands respect. Celebrations mark births, marriages, and successful harvests. Music comes from simple instruments, flutes and drums that accompany singing and dancing. Children play games that teach cooperation and skill, running through narrow streets or along the shore where waves lap at the sand. The sea is always present, its moods familiar. Calm days allow for longer journeys. Rougher weather keeps boats close to shore. Storms are respected but not feared. Your ancestors learned to read the sky and water, to know when conditions favour travel and when it is wiser to wait. This knowledge passes from one generation to the next, carried in stories and observation, in the thousand small lessons that come from living close to something powerful yet predictable. Evenings often find you seated outside, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky shifts through shades of orange and pink, then deepens to blue and finally to the soft darkness where stars emerge one by one. These moments feel timeless, as though your grandparents and their grandparents before them saw the same sky, felt the same breeze, and heard the same gentle sounds of a community settling into rest. This is the world you inhabit, unremarkable in its rhythms yet rich in the small comforts that steady hands and familiar routines provide. The land is generous when tended with care. The sea offers its bounty to those who respect its nature. And the people around you, bound by shared labour and shared seasons, form a web of support that makes life not just survivable, but quietly good. The islands of the Aegean rest on a foundation that is far older than human memory, shaped by forces that work on a timescale measured in thousands and millions of years. Beneath the blue waters and fertile slopes, the earth itself is slowly, constantly in motion. This movement is gentle on a human scale, nearly imperceptible in the span of a single lifetime, but over long ages it has built mountains, opened seas, and created the very ground you walk upon. Your island, like many others in the Aegean, owes its existence to volcanic activity. Deep below the surface, molten rock rises from the Earth's interior, finding pathways through cracks and weaknesses in the crust. When this molten material reaches the surface, it cools and solidifies, layer upon layer, gradually building cones and ridges that eventually break through the sea to become islands. The process is not rapid. It happens in increments, in eruptions separated by decades or centuries, each one adding to what came before. The soil you farm is a gift from these volcanic origins. Ash and weathered lava break down over time into rich, dark earth that holds moisture and nutrients well. This fertility is why your ancestors chose to settle here, why they cleared terraces and planted crops that thrived in soil that seemed almost generous in what it could produce. The volcanic minerals feed the olive trees and grapevines, giving their fruit a quality that traders recognise and value. Not all the islands share the same story. Some are limestone built from ancient seabeds lifted slowly above the water. Others are a mix, volcanic cores surrounded by sedimentary layers deposited when the sea covered what is now land. These differences show in the landscape. Limestone islands often have caves and underground streams, their rock dissolving slowly in rainwater. Volcanic islands tend towards steeper slopes and darker stone, their surfaces newer in geological terms. The Aegean itself is a young sea, carved out as tectonic plates shifted and pulled apart. Where the African plate pushes northward against the Eurasian plate, the Earth responds by folding, faulting, and occasionally releasing tension through earthquakes. These tremors are part of life here, noticed but not dwelled upon. A shaking that rattles cups and sends people outdoors for a moment, then passes. Buildings are constructed with this in mind, walls thick and low, designed to flex rather than shatter. Volcanic islands sometimes show signs of their fiery origins in ways that are visible on the surface. Hot springs bubble up in certain locations, their water carrying minerals that leave colourful deposits on the surrounding rock. Steam vents release warmth into the air. These features are considered useful, even beneficial. The hot water soothes aches and is thought to have healing properties. The warmth from vents can be harnessed for cooking or keeping spaces comfortable during cooler months. Coastlines are not fixed. Over generations they shift in response to the sea's persistent work. Waves carve into softer rock, creating coves and beaches. Sediment carried by rivers and streams accumulates in sheltered bays, gradually extending the land. Cliffs erode, their material tumbling into the water and eventually becoming sand. Harbours that once offered deep anchorage may silt up, requiring communities to adapt, to build in new locations or dredge channels to maintain access. The seafloor itself holds remnants of past landscapes. Pottery shards and stone anchors rest on submerged shelves that were once dry land, drowned when sea levels rose as ice sheets melted at the end of colder periods. These changes happened gradually, over centuries, giving people time to move upslope, to resettle, and to adjust. The stories of those older settlements fade but do not disappear entirely, preserved in fragments and in the collective memory of where ancestors once lived. Islands also rise and fall, though the movement is slow. Tectonic forces can lift sections of the coast, leaving ancient beaches perched above the current shoreline. Other areas subside, sinking gradually so that structures built at the water's edge eventually stand in shallow water. These shifts are noticed when old markers no longer align with the present landscape, when a stone that once sat well above the tide now feels the sea's reach. The volcanic character of the region means that some islands have craters, broad depressions where the centre of the volcano has collapsed inward. These calderas can fill with water, creating sheltered harbours or lakes. The process of collapse is not sudden from a human perspective. It occurs over many eruptions as magma chambers empty and the ground above slowly settles into the space left behind. By the time you see a caldera, it is already ancient, its formation complete long before your community's memory. This landscape, varied and slowly shifting, provides the stage for human life. The same forces that create rich soil and sheltered bays also shape the stories people tell about the world. When the earth shakes, when steam rises from a fissure, when a distant island changes shape over the course of generations, these events become woven into the fabric of understanding. They are explained, remembered, and passed down, not as mysteries, but as parts of the natural order that deserve respect and attention. Stories are the threads that connect one generation to the next, carrying forward what matters most about how the world works and where your community comes from. In a culture without written records, memory is shared through telling and retelling, through the rhythm of repeated phrases and the structure of narratives that make information easier to hold and pass along. This is how knowledge survives, how the past remains present, and how explanations for unusual events take shape and endure. You grow up hearing these stories. They come in the evenings, when work is done and people gather in the fading light. Elders speak, and younger listeners absorb not just the words but the patterns, the ways of describing and explaining that make sense of the world. Some stories are about ancestors, about the founding of your settlement, or the first person to plant an olive tree on this particular hillside. Others explain natural phenomena, offering frameworks for understanding why the earth shakes, why some years bring more rain than others, why certain islands have features that others lack. These narratives are not rigid. Each telling can shift slightly depending on the teller, the audience, and the circumstances. Details are added or subtracted, emphasis moves, and new observations are woven in. This flexibility allows the story to stay relevant and to adapt to what the community knows and needs. Yet the core remains stable, held in place by the structure itself, by phrases that are repeated the same way each time, and by sequences of events that follow a familiar order. When something unusual happens, the community works to make sense of it. An earthquake that is stronger than most, a change in the shape of a nearby island, a particularly vivid sunset that paints the sky in unfamiliar colours. These events are discussed compared to past occurrences, fitted into the framework of what is already understood. Over time, the most striking events become part of the communal memory, shaped into narratives that explain what happened and why it mattered. The process is collaborative. Multiple voices contribute, each adding perspective. Someone remembers a similar event from their childhood. Another recalls what their grandparents said about an even older occurrence. Details are debated, consensus is reached, and gradually a version emerges that satisfies the need for explanation. This version is then repeated and refined through telling, until it settles into a form that can be remembered and passed on. Symbols and imagery help carry these memories. A great wave is described in terms that evoke its size and power, without needing to recount every specific detail. A volcanic eruption might be remembered through the colour of the sky, the smell of the air, and the way ash settled on rooftops. These sensory markers anchor the story, making it vivid enough to stay in memory across years and generations. Geography plays a role in what is remembered. Islands that are visible from your shore are part of your daily experience, and changes to those islands are noticed and remarked upon. More distant places, known only through the accounts of travellers and traders, exist in memory differently. They are real but less immediate, their stories filtered through second-hand tellings. When such places undergo significant change, the news arrives gradually, carried by those who witnessed it or heard about it from others who did. Trade routes spread stories just as they spread goods. A trader from another island brings news of an event, a description of something unusual. This account is shared with your community, compared to what you already know, and incorporated into your understanding. Over time, stories can travel far from their origins, changing shape as they pass through different languages and cultural contexts, but retaining enough of their essence that a trace of the original event remains. Religious and ritual contexts also preserve memory. Certain stories are told as part of seasonal observances or ceremonies that mark important moments in the community's life. These ritual tellings add weight to the narrative, embedding it in a framework that is repeated regularly. The repetition ensures that the story does not fade, that each new generation hears it and learns to tell it themselves. Not every event is remembered equally. Some fade quickly, too ordinary or too small to warrant retelling. Others persist because they touch something fundamental, because they challenged assumptions or required explanation, because they were witnessed by many and discussed widely. The events that endure in memory are those that mattered, that shaped how people understood their world or altered the landscape in ways that could not be ignored. The line between history and myth is not always clear. Over generations, the details of an actual event can become embellished, simplified, or combined with elements from other stories. A flood that displaced communities might be remembered as a great inundation, its causes attributed to divine action, or cosmic shifts rather than the specific geological processes that triggered it. This transformation is not a failure of memory, but a reflection of how oral tradition works, preserving the impact of an event even as the precise mechanisms fade into the background. Your role as a listener is to receive these stories, to hold them in your own memory so that you can pass them on when the time comes. You learn to recognize the patterns, to understand when a story is being told for instruction and when it is being shared for reflection. You notice how certain tales are told to children to teach them about safety or respect for the natural world, while others are shared among adults who can appreciate the complexity and nuance. This web of shared memory creates continuity. It ties your community to the land and sea, to the events that shaped both, and to the understanding that what you experience now is part of a longer story. The earth shifts, the sea changes, and people adapt. These truths are held in the stories you carry, in the knowledge that is given freely and received with care, in the ongoing conversation between past and present that defines who you are. Life in the Aegean is shaped not only by work, but also by the patterns of rest that allow you to sustain effort over time. These rhythms are as essential as the labour itself, providing structure to your days and marking the transitions between seasons, between periods of intensity and periods of ease. Midday rest is a practice woven into the fabric of daily routine. As the sun climbs and the heat intensifies, activity slows. Fields are left, boats secured, and people retreat to shaded spaces or the cool interiors of their homes. This pause is not laziness, but wisdom, a recognition that the hottest hours are better spent conserving energy than expending it. You rest, sometimes sleeping, sometimes simply sitting in stillness, while the world outside shimmers with heat. During these quiet hours, the landscape itself seems to pause. Animals seek shade, birds are less vocal. The sea reflects the sky in a smooth, glassy surface. This is a time that feels suspended, as though the day is holding its breath before resuming. When the temperature begins to drop and the light softens, activity resumes gradually, with people emerging to complete tasks or begin new ones with the benefit of cooler air. Evenings offer a different kind of rest, communal and reflective. As work ends, you gather with neighbours, sharing simple meals or sitting together while children play nearby. Conversations meander, touching on the events of the day, plans for tomorrow, and observations about weather or crops. There is no urgency, only the gentle exchange of thoughts and presence. Nighttime brings a deeper rest, the kind that allows the body to recover and the mind to process the accumulation of experience. You sleep on woven mats or simple beds, the air moving through open windows or doorways. In warmer months, some people sleep on rooftops, where breezes carry the scent of the sea and the sky stretches overhead, vast and filled with stars. This practice turns sleep into a connection with the larger world, a reminder that you are part of something greater than the confines of walls and daily tasks. The rhythm of the year also includes longer periods of rest. After harvest, when the work of gathering and storing is complete, there is time to repair, to create, and to engage in projects that cannot be pursued during busier seasons. This is when new tools are made, when textiles are woven, and when attention can be given to crafts that require patience and focus. The pace is slower, the pressure lessened, and this interval allows you to approach the next cycle of planting and growth with renewed energy. Festivals and communal celebrations punctuate the year, serving as both rest and renewal. These gatherings interrupt the routine, offering time for music, dancing, feasting, and the kinds of interactions that strengthen bonds between people. Preparations for a festival are themselves a form of rest from regular labour, a shift in focus that feels lighter even as it requires effort. The celebration itself is a release, a collective exhaling that marks the passage of time and the continuation of community. Rest is also found in the small pauses throughout the day, a moment to watch the sea, to notice the play of light on water, a brief stop to greet a neighbour, to exchange a few words that carry warmth and recognition. These intervals are not planned but arise naturally, and they serve to break the monotony of repetitive tasks, to remind you that life is not only about accomplishment, but also about presence. Sleep, too, varies with the seasons. Longer winter nights offer extended rest, a gift of darkness that allows the body to recover from the exertions of the year. Summer nights are shorter, but often broken by the need to tend to animals or to check on drying crops. Even so, the total amount of rest balances over time, the body adjusting to the demands and opportunities of each season. Children learn these rhythms by living within them, observing when adults pause and understanding that rest is part of the natural order. They nap when tired, play when energized, and absorb the knowledge that there is a time for everything. This education is subtle, delivered not through instruction, but through the simple act of participating in a community that values rest as much as it values work. Even in times of change, when the land shifts or the sea behaves unexpectedly, the rhythms of rest persist. After an earthquake, once the immediate response is complete and safety is confirmed, people return to their beds. After a storm passes and the damage is assessed, routines resume. This continuity is reassuring, a signal that while individual events may disrupt, the larger patterns of life remain intact. Rest also carries a spiritual dimension, though it is not always articulated as such. In pausing, in allowing time for stillness and reflection, you create space for a different kind of awareness. The world reveals itself in these quiet moments, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small observations. The way light changes as the sun sets, the sound of waves meeting the shore in a steady, unchanging rhythm, the coolness of stone under your hand as you lean against a wall, breathing slowly and feeling the day settle around you. These rhythms of rest, daily and seasonal, provide the scaffolding that supports all other aspects of life. Without them, the work would become unsustainable, the community would fray, and the connection to the land and sea would weaken. But with them, life finds balance, moving between effort and ease, between action and stillness, in a pattern that has sustained your people for as long as memory holds. The Aegean Sea is not a barrier, but a pathway, a network of routes that connects island to island and coast to coast. The water that surrounds you is familiar territory, its moods and rhythms as well known as the land itself. Fishermen navigate by landmarks, by the shape of distant hills and the position of the sun, by knowledge passed down through countless voyages. The sea is where livelihoods are earned and where relationships with other communities are built and maintained. Trade is the lifeblood of this interconnected world. Your island produces certain things in abundance, olives and oil perhaps, or pottery shaped from local clay. Other islands have their own specialties, wine, grain, or woven textiles dyed in colours specific to their region. These goods move across the water in small boats, carried by traders who know the routes and the people at each destination. The exchanges are personal, built on trust and the expectation of reciprocity. You give what you have in surplus, and you receive what you lack, and the relationship continues year after year. Harbours serve as gathering points, places where boats arrive and depart, where news is shared and plans are made. These spaces are busy but not chaotic, organised by the routines that govern loading and unloading, by the customs that dictate when and how transactions occur. Traders know each other, greet each other by name, inquire after families and conditions on other islands. The harbour is where the wider world touches your daily life, where the Aegean reveals itself as a community of communities rather than a collection of isolated settlements. Navigation relies on observation and experience. Sailors learn to read the sea, to recognise currents and wind patterns, and to understand how weather systems move across the region. Certain times of year are more favourable for long journeys, when winds blow steadily from predictable directions and storms are less frequent. Other periods call for caution, for staying closer to shore and being prepared to shelter if conditions change. This knowledge is practical and essential, the difference between safe passage and unnecessary risk. Islands are not uniform in their resources or their geography, and this variation drives trade. An island with good harbours but limited farmland imports grain. Another with abundant timber exports wood for boat building and construction. Obsidian from volcanic islands travels widely, valued for tools and weapons. Salt, fish and preserved foods move from coastal settlements to inland regions. Each exchange strengthens the network, creating interdependence that benefits all participants. Cultural exchange accompanies the movement of goods. Traders carry stories, songs and techniques from one place to another. A method of weaving learned on one island is shared and adapted by artisans elsewhere. A musical instrument becomes popular across the region. Religious practices and symbols spread, sometimes merging with local traditions to create new forms of expression. This flow of ideas is gradual but persistent, a quiet blending that enriches each community without erasing its distinct character. The boats themselves are practical vessels designed for the specific conditions of the Aegean. They are small enough to be handled by a few people, but sturdy enough to manage open water. Construction methods are refined over generations, each builder learning from those who came before and contributing their own improvements. Sails are woven from plant fibres, and oars are shaped from wood that balances strength and flexibility. Repairs are made as needed, a constant process of maintenance that keeps the fleet functional. Fishing and trading often overlap. A boat that goes out for fish may also carry goods to exchange at a nearby island. The return journey brings back what was acquired, along with a fresh catch. This efficiency is typical of a culture that values resourcefulness, where every trip serves multiple purposes and nothing is wasted. Time on the water is used well, and the relationships formed through these repeated interactions become as valuable as the goods being traded. Seasonal patterns affect trade routes. Certain products are only available at specific times of year, and traders plan their journeys accordingly. Olive oil is pressed after the autumn harvest, and boats carry it to markets while the supply is fresh. Grain moves after the summer harvest. Wine ferments through the fall and winter, ready for transport in spring. These cycles create predictable rhythms, a calendar of exchange that structures the year. Shared festivals and gatherings bring people from multiple islands together, creating opportunities for trade but also for celebration and connection. These events are anticipated, prepared for with care, and enjoyed as communal experiences that reinforce the bonds between settlements. Goods change hands, yes, but so do stories, friendships, and the sense of belonging to something larger than a single island or household. The sea also serves as a source of shared identity. People who live on islands understand the water in ways that those on the mainland do not. They know its gifts and its demands, its capacity for both abundance and challenge. This understanding creates a common ground, a basis for mutual respect and cooperation. When you meet someone from another island, there is recognition, an immediate sense of kinship that comes from navigating the same waters and depending on the same currents. Pirates and raiders exist, but they are not the defining feature of sea travel. Most journeys are peaceful, encounters are friendly, and the expectation is cooperation rather than conflict. When problems arise, they are dealt with through negotiation and community response. The network of islands functions best when trust is maintained, and most people have a stake in preserving that trust. Trade also carries risk. Weather can turn unexpectedly, boats can be damaged, and goods can be lost. These risks are managed through experience and caution, through choosing routes carefully and paying attention to signs. Losses occur, but they are absorbed by the community, shared among those who participate in the network. No single failure is catastrophic because the system itself is resilient, built on many connections rather than relying on just a few. The movement of people accompanies the movement of goods. Families sometimes relocate to other islands, seeking new opportunities or joining relatives. Marriages connect communities, creating ties that span the water. Craftspeople travel to learn new techniques or to find markets for their work. This mobility is accepted, even encouraged, as part of what keeps the region vibrant and adaptable. In all of this, the sea remains central, the medium through which connection happens. Its presence is constant, its character familiar, and the life built around it reflects an understanding that isolation is not desirable or sustainable. The Aegean is a world of relationships, of exchanges and interactions that create a fabric of shared existence. Trade is the practical expression of that, but the deeper reality is community, the knowledge that you are not alone, that others face the same challenges and share the same hopes, and that the sea, vast and ever-present, ties you all together. When the sun dips below the horizon and the day's work is complete, a different kind of time begins. Evenings are for gathering, for the quiet conversations and storytelling that knit the community together. This is when the past becomes present, when memories are shared and the accumulated wisdom of generations is passed along. You settle into a familiar spot, perhaps on a low wall or a bench worn smooth by years of use. Others join, arriving in twos and threes, their faces lit by the last of the daylight and then by the glow of oil lamps or the small fire that someone has kindled. The transition from day to evening is gradual, marked not by abrupt change but by the gentle shift in light and temperature, by the way voices soften and the pace of movement slowing. Stories emerge naturally from conversation. Someone mentions a task completed or a challenge faced, and this reminds another of a similar situation from years ago. The memory is shared, details offered, and soon the group is engaged in a collective recollection. These stories are not grand narratives, but the small histories that make up daily life, the lessons learned from experience and the patterns noticed over time. Elders are central to this process. Their years have given them a depth of knowledge that younger people respect and seek out. When an elder speaks, others listen, not out of obligation, but because what is being offered has value. The elder's memory reaches back further, connecting the present to times that others can only know through these accounts. Events that happened decades ago are described. Places that have changed are recalled as they once were, and through this sharing, the continuity of the community is reinforced. The stories are not limited to human affairs. Much of what is shared concerns the natural world, the observations that help explain how things work, the behaviour of animals, the patterns of weather, and the cycles of growth and dormancy. These topics are endlessly interesting because they are endlessly relevant. Understanding the world around you is survival, but it is also satisfaction, the pleasure of seeing connections and making sense of what you observe. Volcanic activity and earthquakes find their way into these evening conversations, not as sources of fear, but as subjects of explanation. Someone describes an earthquake from their childhood, how the ground moved and what happened afterward. Another recalls seeing smoke rise from a distant island, the way the sky looked for days following. These accounts are measured, factual in tone, and focused on what was noticed and how the community responded. The emphasis is on adaptation, on the ways people adjusted and continued. The language used in storytelling has a rhythm to it, a cadence that makes the narratives easier to remember and repeat. Certain phrases recur, markers that signal familiar territory, a description of the sea's colour, the way ash smells, the sound of stones settling after a tremor. These details anchor the story, giving it texture and making it vivid enough to persist in memory. When you hear a story told multiple times, you begin to recognise these elements, and they become part of your own internal library of images and sensations. Children are present at these gatherings, absorbing what is said even when they do not fully understand it. They learn by listening, by watching how stories are told, and how adults engage with the past. Some stories are directed specifically at them, simplified and shaped to teach particular lessons. Others are for the whole group, and children glean what they can, their understanding deepening as they grow and hear the same stories again in different contexts. Reflection is as important as the stories themselves. After a narrative is shared, there is often a pause, a space where people consider what was said. Someone might add a detail, or offer a different perspective, or simply sit with the information and let it settle. This quietness is valued, a recognition that meaning is not always immediate, that understanding can deepen in the silence following words. Humour appears in these gatherings, gentle and warm. Someone makes an observation about human nature, a wry comment on the predictability of certain behaviours, or the irony of situations that repeat across generations. Laughter is soft, more a shared acknowledgement than a loud release. It serves to lighten the mood without diminishing the substance of what is being discussed. The physical setting contributes to the atmosphere. The evening air is cooler, a relief after the heat of the day. The sky darkens gradually, stars appearing one by one until the dome above is filled with light. The sea is audible, a steady backdrop of waves meeting the shore. These sensory elements create a context that feels safe and conducive to openness, to the kind of sharing that happens when people are relaxed and comfortable. Memory itself is a topic of reflection. People discuss how certain events are remembered and why some details persist while others fade. There is an awareness that memory is not perfect, that it shifts and is shaped by retelling, but there is also confidence in the collective nature of the process. What one person forgets, another remembers. Discrepancies are noted and discussed, and a version emerges that the group can accept as close enough to what happened. These evening gatherings serve multiple purposes. They educate, preserving knowledge that is essential for navigating the world. They entertain, providing enjoyment and the pleasure of narrative. They connect, strengthening the bonds between individuals and reinforcing the sense of shared identity. And they comfort, offering the reassurance that comes from continuity, from knowing that you are part of a lineage that stretches back and will continue forward. As the evening deepens, the conversation eventually winds down. People begin to drift away, heading to their homes and the rest that awaits. The fire, if there was one, burns low. The lamps are extinguished or carried inside. The gathering dissolves, but the stories linger, held in the minds of those who heard them, ready to be recalled and shared again when the next evening comes. Night settles over the Aegean with a gentle completeness. The last light fades from the western sky, and darkness becomes a presence that wraps around the island, softening edges and quieting sounds. This is the time when rest deepens, when the world pauses in a way that feels both familiar and timeless. You lie on your sleeping mat, the fabric cool against your skin. Through the open doorway or window, you can see a slice of sky. Stars bright and clear in the absence of competing light. The moon, if it is visible, casts a pale glow that touches rooftops and the surface of the sea, creating a landscape rendered in shades of silver and shadow. This light is enough to navigate by if needed, but mostly it serves as a gentle presence, a reminder that even in darkness, the world is not empty. The sounds of night are subtle. The sea continues its rhythm, waves arriving and retreating in a pattern that requires no attention, yet provides a constant, soothing background. Occasionally a night bird calls, or the breeze stirs through the olive trees with a rustling whisper. These sounds are part of the fabric of nighttime, familiar and unremarkable, but together they create an atmosphere of calm. Sleep comes easily after a day of physical work. Your body, tired in the way that comes from useful effort, relaxes fully. Breathing slows, thoughts drift, and consciousness gradually releases its grip on the details of the day. Dreams may come, sometimes vivid, sometimes vague, but they are just another part of the night's experience, neither significant nor troubling. For those who remain awake, nighttime offers a different quality of awareness. Fishermen who work at night move quietly, preparing nets and boats with practiced efficiency. Their work is focused and deliberate, shaped by the need to be ready when the time is right to launch. Night fishing has its own rewards, certain species more easily caught in darkness, and the men who pursue this work know the rhythms and the techniques that make it successful. Watchfulness is part of nighttime culture, though it is not anxious or fearful. Someone might check on livestock, ensuring that animals are secure. Another might walk the perimeter of the settlement, a casual patrol that confirms all is well. These actions are habitual, a way of maintaining order without needing to articulate the reasons. The community functions on these small acts of care, repeated so often that they become automatic. Children sleep deeply, their rest untroubled. Their bodies, still growing, require long hours of sleep, and they give themselves over to it completely. Parents listen for sounds that might indicate distress, but mostly they trust that all is well, that the night is safe, and their children are protected within it. This trust is not blind but earned, based on countless nights that have passed without incident. The stars overhead have their own significance. They mark the passage of seasons, certain constellations appearing at specific times of year. Sailors use them for navigation, but even those who do not venture far from shore know the major patterns, the clusters and shapes that have names and stories attached. The stars are constant in a way that the changing landscape of the earth is not, and this constancy is comforting. Occasionally the night sky offers something unusual. A meteor streaks across the darkness, bright and brief. A planet shines with a steadier light than the stars. These phenomena are noticed and remarked upon, but they do not inspire dread. They are parts of the natural world, events that happen on their own schedule, and while they are interesting, they do not disrupt the fundamental sense of order. The moon cycle is tracked, its phases noted because they affect tides and light. A full moon provides enough illumination for certain activities, allowing work to extend into the evening. A new moon brings darker nights, but also the brilliance of stars undiminished by reflected light. Each phase has its character, and people adjust their routines accordingly. Night is also when the land seems to breathe differently. The heat of the day dissipates, and coolness rises from the ground. Dew forms on leaves and grass, small droplets that catch the moonlight. The air smells different, cleaner somehow, less layered with the sense of human activity. This freshness is one of night's quiet gifts, a renewal that happens without fanfare. For some, nighttime is a period of reflection. Lying awake in the darkness, thoughts wander to questions and considerations that the busyness of the day does not allow. These are not worries but contemplations, the mind turning over ideas at its own pace. Solutions to problems sometimes arrive in these quiet hours, insights emerging when the usual distractions are absent. The continuity of night to night is part of what makes life feel stable. Each evening the sun sets, each morning it rises, and in between there is this interval of rest and quiet. The reliability of this cycle is foundational, a rhythm that does not change even when other things do. Earthquakes happen, weather varies, but night still comes, and with it the opportunity to rest. Sleep itself is seen as restorative, a necessary part of maintaining health and balance. Communities value rest, understanding that without it, people become less capable and less resilient. The practice of retiring early and rising with the sun is not enforced by rule, but by the natural alignment of human biology with the available light. There is no reason to burn oil unnecessarily, and the darkness invites sleep in a way that feels right. The transition from night to morning is gradual. The sky begins to lighten almost imperceptibly, a shift from black to deep blue. Birds start to sing, their calls announcing the coming day. People wake, stretching and preparing to begin again. The night has done its work, providing rest and continuity, and now it steps aside for the activity and warmth of a new day. This nightly rhythm, repeated endlessly, is one of the most fundamental aspects of existence. It requires no maintenance, no effort, yet it shapes everything. In its constancy, night offers a kind of reassurance, a guarantee that no matter what happens during the daylight hours, there will be this return to calm, this opportunity to lay down the day's concerns and simply be. The years turn, each one adding to the layers of experience and memory that make up your community's understanding of the world. Events happen, some ordinary and some unusual, but all are integrated into the ongoing story of life in the Aegean. The landscape shifts slowly, almost imperceptibly within a single lifetime, yet over generations the changes accumulate and become part of what is known and remembered. Volcanic islands sometimes alter their appearance. A vent that was active becomes dormant. A crater fills with rainwater and transforms into a lake. New land emerges from the sea after an eruption, cooling and solidifying until it is firm enough to walk on, though it may take decades before anything grows there. These changes are noticed and incorporated into the mental maps that people carry, adjustments made to reflect the current state of the geography. When such changes are significant enough to affect daily life, they enter the realm of shared memory. A harbour that silts up and becomes unusable is remembered, the story of its decline told so that future generations understand why a particular bay is no longer suitable for anchorage. An earthquake that alters the coastline is recalled in terms of the landmarks that shifted, the stone that tumbled, the way people adapted by building in new locations or reinforcing structures differently. The process of turning an event into memory is gradual. Immediate experience is vivid but chaotic, filled with details that may or may not matter in the long run. As time passes, the memory is refined. What seemed important in the moment may fade, while other aspects gain significance through reflection and discussion. The community collectively decides what is worth preserving, and the story that emerges is shaped by this consensus. In some cases, events from different times or places become conflated. A great flood remembered from one generation is merged with a similar event from another, creating a single narrative that represents both. This is not deception, but the natural working of memory, which organizes information by pattern and theme rather than by strict chronology. The resulting story may not be historically precise, but it captures the truth of what such events mean, how they feel, and how people respond. Geological processes that unfold over centuries are harder to track, but their effects are still noted. Coastlines that gradually submerge, leaving old structures partially underwater, become subjects of speculation and narrative. Why did the sea rise? What caused the land to sink? The answers provided may invoke divine action or cosmic shifts, frameworks that make sense within the cultural context even if they do not align with the actual mechanisms. What matters is that the community has an explanation, something that allows them to understand their world as coherent and meaningful. The idea of Atlantis, though you would not know it by that name, begins to take shape in this way. Somewhere in the collective memory of the Aegean, there are stories of islands that change dramatically, of prosperous settlements that were disrupted by natural forces, and of landscapes that were transformed in ways that seemed almost beyond belief. These stories travel, passing from one community to another, blending with other narratives, acquiring details and symbolic weight as they go. By the time such a story reaches a distant place, far from its origin, it has been reshaped many times, the specific details of which island and when have become less clear, but the core idea remains. There was a place, advanced and prosperous, that met with sudden transformation. The story serves as a reflection on impermanence, on the power of nature, on the limits of human control. It is not primarily a historical record, but a narrative that carries meaning, a way of articulating truths about existence that are felt deeply, even if not always spoken directly. You do not know that this story will one day be recorded in texts, that philosophers and historians will debate its origins, or that people in distant times will search for the physical location of Atlantis. For you, it is simply part of the fabric of memory, one story among many that help explain the world. The connection to Santorini, to the eruption that dramatically altered that island's shape, is there in the layers of memory, but it is not isolated or singular. It is woven together with other events, other islands, and other moments when the Earth demonstrated its capacity for change. This weaving is what memory does. It creates continuity not by preserving every detail with perfect accuracy, but by holding on to what matters, by finding patterns and meanings that transcend individual events. The stories that survive are those that serve the community, that teach, that explain, that provide comfort or caution. They are tools for making sense of a world that is dynamic and sometimes unpredictable, yet also reliable and knowable in its broader patterns. As you age, you become one of the carriers of this memory. The stories you heard as a child are now yours to tell, and you notice how your own telling has shifted slightly from what you remember hearing. This is expected, even necessary. Each generation adds its perspective and its experiences, and the story evolves without losing its essence. The process is collaborative and continuous, a conversation across time that does not end. The land and sea continue their slow work. Islands rise and fall, coasts erode and build, and volcanic vents open and close. Life adapts to these changes. Communities relocate or rebuild, and the memory of what was sustains them through the transitions. There is no final state, only an ongoing process, and within that process is the steady rhythm of human presence, observing, adapting, and remembering. The night sky, unchanged in its essential pattern, serves as a constant reference point. The stars you see are the same stars your ancestors saw, and this continuity is profound. It connects you to the past in a way that is direct and visceral, a reminder that while the earth beneath you shifts, some things remain. This balance between change and constancy is what allows life to continue, what makes adaptation possible without loss of identity. The stories you tell, the memories you hold, are part of this same balance. They anchor you to the past while allowing flexibility for the present. They provide context without dictating exact responses. They are living things, sustained through use, through the care taken in telling and listening, through the recognition that what is passed down has value that transcends the moment. In the end, the geomythology of the Santorini eruption and the story of Atlantis is not about destruction or loss, but about memory and meaning. It is about how communities understand and explain the changes they witness, and how they integrate dramatic events into the ongoing narrative of existence. The eruption, when it happened, was a geological event, a release of energy and material that reshaped the island. But over time it became something more, a touchstone in the collective memory, a symbol of transformation that carried lessons and reflections forward through the generations. You rest now, your thoughts settling as the day fades completely into night. The sea is calm, the stars are bright, and the land beneath you is ancient and enduring. Tomorrow will come with its routines and its surprises, and you will meet it with the knowledge and resilience that have been passed down to you. The story continues, as it always has, woven from memory and experience, from land and sea, from the quiet continuity that defines life in the Aegean.